Hello there, dear listener. I'm so glad you've decided to come along with me on this trip through time to dive into the fascinating realm of medieval hobbies and amusements. No matter where you are in the world at this moment, whether it's daytime, dusk, or the dead of night, I encourage you to get cozy. Let your worries fade and allow my voice to create colorful scenes in your imagination. As you relax, I'd be curious to hear where on this vast planet you're listening from and what the hour is in your part of the world. Go ahead and drop a comment if you'd like. And if you appreciate soothing, offbeat narratives that make history feel alive and engaging, I kindly suggest subscribing so you won't miss any of our relaxing excursions into bygone eras. But there's no need to worry about that at the moment. All you have to do is unwind, take deep breaths, and let me softly carry you to an era far removed from our own, when existence was quite unlike today. An age of fortresses and monarchs, commoners and epidemics, knightly honor and folklore, a period known as the Middle Ages. When most folks picture the medieval era, they tend to imagine a life full of struggle and monotony. And indeed, for the bulk of the population during this time, which generally ran from the 5th to the 15th century, survival was tough. It was a system where a tiny elite of aristocrats held power over a huge group of laborers. For the typical serf working the land or the trainee learning a craft, every day brought challenges to stay alive. Yet, even amid conflict, illness, injustice, and exhausting work, people's resilience shone through. And those in the Middle Ages, much like individuals in any historical period, discovered methods to handle their circumstances and momentarily step into worlds of happiness, festivity, and leisure. Some of these activities might feel somewhat recognizable to us, whereas others span from completely odd to truly perilous. So join me as we step away from the modern world for a bit and uncover the exciting approaches that aristocrats and ordinary people, warriors and servants, fools and young women used to add some enjoyment to their challenging existences. This exploration will guide us from the impressive jousting areas to the lively dining rooms, from the foggy woodlands to the dirty festival sites. While delving into these forgotten recreations, we'll encounter a quirky array of figures. Some brave, some wicked, and plenty simply striving to survive in a setting vastly different from ours. We'll observe the honorable actions of the most legendary knight ever. Discover the techniques of an expert cook who established the benchmark for French cooking, and lament the sorrowful end of a singer who became a saint. Along the way, we'll develop a stronger grasp of how people thought back then, and admire the creativity and toughness of those who discovered brightness in gloom, humor in hardship, and amusement amid suffering. So extinguish that light, plump up that cushion, and let's travel back to an era when enjoyment was earned through effort, but all the sweeter for it. One of the most splendid and well-known types of medieval amusement was the tournament. These detailed military contests allowed knights to display their fighting skills, captivate the high-born women, and advance in society. But more than that, they were major occasions that brought a burst of vibrancy, thrill, and ceremony for individuals from every level. Tournaments usually occurred on expansive areas beyond cities and continued for multiple days. Picture the setting. Lines of vibrant shelters and structures accommodating the participating knights and their groups. Standards and pennants displaying family crests waving in the wind. sellers offering snacks and mementos to the assembled spectators. The atmosphere buzzing with eagerness, and the noise of crowds, steeds, and metal gear. Naturally, the highlights were the knights, akin to today's star sports figures and famous personalities. Dressed in shining plate, decorated with bright fabrics, they created an impressive show as they marched through the field on their grand battle horses. One knight towered over the others in fame and tournament ability. His name was William Marshall, and his tale seems like it came right from a fairy story. Born as the youngest child of a lesser aristocrat in 1146, Marshall was basically an additional burden. Thus, his father did what many lords did with extra boys in that period. He basically gave young William to the religious order as an oblate. However, the spirited Marshall wasn't suited for a life of quiet reflection. In his early years, he preferred fighting over devotion. Fortunately, his abilities attracted the notice of a prominent lord who chose to educate him in knighthood. It turned out to be a very lucky choice. Marshall adapted to the ways of chivalry as naturally as a duck to a pond. But what really helped him stand out was his bold performance on the tournament scene. In a time when aristocrats frequently had to pay large sums if beaten in combat or taken captive, the prizes available at tournaments presented an appealing option. And William Marshall was exceptionally talented at succeeding in them. Records from the time state he triumphed in an incredible 500 tilts. That's an impressive streak, even if exaggerated a bit. But without question, Marshall was the Michael Jordan of the medieval tournament scene. A revered and famous individual. A single-person attraction who attracted massive audiences anywhere he appeared. His achievements in the arena led to prominence in royal circles. During his lengthy life, Marshall would act as a trusted advisor to no fewer than 5 English monarchs, especially Richard the Lionheart and his sibling John. He stayed a model of faithfulness and insight through various rules, uprisings, plots, and full-scale conflicts. By his passing in 1219, he had climbed from modest beginnings to one of the most influential and admired figures in the kingdom, the Earl of Pembroke and guardian of the youthful King Henry III. But let's return to those tournaments, since that's where Marshall initially gained recognition. A tournament was a far more chaotic and rowdy event than the polished Renaissance fair jousts we see nowadays. Actually, the earliest tournaments were basically simulated wars, chaotic clashes where big teams of knights fought to seize one another for payment. As one might expect, these initial events frequently turned into genuine and hazardous fights, particularly when grudges and anger flared. The chaos could cause serious harm and even fatalities, to the extent that the Vatican attempted to prohibit tournaments completely as unnecessarily hazardous to health and safety. Those orders were mostly disregarded naturally, but they did encourage the elite to try imposing regulations and reducing the violence. By Marshall's era in the late 12th century, tournaments had developed into rather more organized and regulated gatherings, while keeping a sense of danger and surprise that held audiences captivated. The one-on-one joust became the highlight, with knights facing off to knock each other down using spear and defense. Even so, major injuries happened often. Marshall himself reportedly had a spear go straight through his leg in one contest. But for the most adept and clever knights, the dangers were balanced by the possible gains of redemption fees, a winner's portion of the rewards, prized battle steeds and gear, and the approval of a pleased noble sponsor. To truly understand what these tournaments were like during their peak popularity, let's focus on one particularly notable or maybe notorious event that occurred in 1274. The location was the northern French area of Chalons, and the main participants were the bold English Prince Edward, who would eventually become King Edward I, and the Count of Chalons, a French aristocrat. According to a report from the period, the issues began when Edward arrived at the tournament site with a group of no fewer than 200 knights. The large scale of his party was viewed as a boastful display by the French organizers, who were accustomed to being the dominant force at their own events. The Count of Chalons was especially offended by the apparent insult. Matters escalated on the tournament field before thousands of onlookers. One of Edward's knights won his tilt against the Count's son, which surely irritated the French noble. Angry exchanges followed, and before anyone realized, the Count of Chalons rushed at the prince directly, spear ready. Poor decision. Edward skillfully evaded the strike and swiftly overpowered his impulsive opponent. As one observer described, the prince seized the count by the neck, hurled him from his mount into the dirt, and hit him with his hand between the shoulders so the sound carried to those far away. What a princely brawl! The shamed count retreated to recover while Edward enjoyed the applause of the audience. It was the sort of intense clash and remarkable feat of skill that made tournaments such thrilling shows. Naturally, after the excitement died down, there remained the annoying issue of diplomacy to handle. The French king, who was the uncle to both Edward and the Count of Chalons, was far from happy about the political mishap close to home. It required some careful negotiation to calm the upset royals and maintain harmony between England and France, at least temporarily. Events like this simply demonstrate how tournaments, beyond serving as lively diversions, also reflected the political disputes and maneuvers of medieval culture. They might have been pretend fights, but the competitions and goals behind them were entirely genuine. Well, dear listener, I believe that's plenty of tilting and tussling for now. We've barely touched the polished exterior of medieval amusements, and there are countless more wonders and joys to uncover. But those must wait for another occasion. For the time being, I'll say a warm good night and let you envision valiant knights, waving flags, and the rumble of horses across a tournament area. May you discover peace, relief, and insight in the embrace of the past. Until we meet again, this is your loyal recorder of ancient times, hoping you have a tranquil rest filled only with the most pleasant medieval imaginings. Good night. The hunter relies on his faithful dogs leading the way. Aristocratic hunting canines like deerhounds, alants, and limers barked and sniffed with enthusiasm, ready to be released to pursue any unlucky deer, boar, or hare that appeared. Sharp-sighted greyhounds stayed beside the noble riders on their horses, prepared to dash forward once game was sighted. And naturally, the aristocratic hunting group would always include its collection of noisy dogs of various breeds and sizes, even though they often dashed off following scents at the worst moments. But an elite hunt wasn't a random frenzy of wild dogs rampaging through the woods without order. There was a methodical procedure, a ceremony to everything, and everyone had a role to fulfill. The Guardians of the Woods, yes, that was their official name, scouted in advance to locate the target, searching for tracks and droppings to figure out where the most appealing stag or most delicious hare could be concealed. The head of the kennels and his assistants managed the dogs, all taught to react to specific calls and shouts, supposedly at least. A brief blast meant the hunt was beginning, while a prolonged sound indicated that the target was seen, though it likely all sounded like chaos to the unfortunate animal facing its doom at the end of a noble's weapon. Once the hunters released the collars and the dogs bolted like a rainbow of scruffy energy into the bushes, the human participants leaped into motion on their mounts. They trailed the howling dogs, the hunter's signal, and the guardians pushing through the trees ahead, pursuing their target with shouts and calls that undoubtedly scared every deer within a 10-mile area into flight. With fortune on their side, the dogs would trap the stag, boar, or whatever poor beast they were after, keeping it cornered while the aristocratic lord or lady delivered the final strike with a push of their spear or a precisely aimed shot. And with one last cry, the pursuit ended, and the noble hunters stood proudly with their trophy for a very old-fashioned equivalent of a social media snapshot. After an extended day of racing through the forest and taking the lives of several unfortunate creatures, one developed a strong hunger. Fortunately, the hunting party would head back to a meal arranged on stands in vibrant silk tents adorned with emblems and standards. A well-deserved break following a tiring day. Attendants and young helpers hurried back and forth carrying cups and platters loaded with cooked meats, soups, and delicate treats to refresh the weary hunters. The dogs that caught the game received the heart and innards as their prize, while their elite owners got the best portions to enjoy. Not quite the kind of takeaway you'd get at a contemporary eatery, but I'm certain the dogs had no complaints. Finally, with one last victorious note from the horn, the aristocratic hunters wrapped up the day. The dogs were returned to their enclosures, the horses relieved of their gear, and the untouched remains transported back to the fortress kitchens for the staff to handle. The high-born hunters assembled to share stories of their most courageous takedowns and impressive weapon strikes. Some tales might have been exaggerated a little after several drinks of wine before heading to their rooms, tired but energized from a full day of searching, chasing, and ending the lives of helpless animals. Just another leisurely activity for the medieval aristocrats, and definitely more exciting than embroidery. But not every lord and lady was content with killing the nearby animals for sport. Some aimed a little higher, quite literally. Let's shift our focus to the ancient and prestigious practice of falconry, the ideal pursuit for anyone desiring a companion that could eliminate other creatures at will. Because who needs to snuggle with an adorable rabbit when you could have a raptor resting on your arm, prepared to dig its claws into any small, furry forest dweller that seemed particularly appetizing that day? Falconry was like the luxury aircraft of medieval pursuits. While any typical noble could assemble some dogs and charge through the woods after a deer, it required a unique type to excel in falconry. Trainers known as falconers had to catch and educate their birds via a meticulous method involving covers, straps, and a great deal of endurance. Like a very strict academy, young birds began as eyasses, then turned into passage birds, and eventually reached the stage of haggards. Terms that seem better suited for a motorcycle club than a group of birds. But the Middle Ages had a knack for drama. Once a falcon was prepared, the true enjoyment started. The aristocratic falconer, with the bird sitting regally on their protected hand, rode out looking for targets, scanning the heavens and meadows for a sign of something small and furry, ideally not too quick. When a suitable victim was noticed, the falcon was released, diving through the air like a plumed projectile aimed at the pounding heart of a frightened rabbit or pheasant or whatever unlucky animal was fated to be the falcon's chosen meal that day. If everything proceeded smoothly for the falcon and falconer, not as much for the target, the bird drove its keen talons into the little creature, letting out a victorious call to notify its human partner that the task was complete. The aristocratic falconer collected their bird and its catch, giving it a couple of tasty bits before setting it back on its stand for the return journey. Obviously, falconry demanded a strong connection and clear signals between person and bird, along with a mutual interest in violent pursuits. Among the elite, falconry was the supreme emblem of rank. The larger and scarcer your bird, the more notable you appeared. Similar to today's luxury vehicle enthusiasts, the upper class vied for the most elegant, strongest raptors to flaunt. For example, the gerfalcon, a grand white bird that could hit speeds of up to 130 miles while chasing prey, was the Lamborghini of falconry. Extremely desired and valued at a fortune. European aristocrats dominated the hawking scene, but they weren't the sole ones who valued a bird capable of killing on order. In the Middle East, falconry was a long-standing custom, believed to trace back thousands of years to the wandering groups of the Central Asian steppes, who first realized that raptors were superior hunters compared to people with bows and arrows. The Mongols, those tough horse-riding fighters who conquered across Asia and Europe in the 13th century, were also enthusiastic falconers who carried their passion for deadly birds along as they overran half the known world. But while falconry might have originated in warfare, it soon turned into the preferred leisure of the upper class from Morocco to Mongolia. The Arab caliphs and Persian rulers maintained grand aviaries stocked with hundreds of birds and a team of falconers to care for them. Falcons even appeared in Islamic artwork and writings as emblems of aristocracy and elegance, which is much kinder than being recalled as lethal aerial marionettes, which is basically what they were. But as with many elements in the Middle Ages, falconry was as much about ostentatious shows of riches and position as it was about actually capturing game. The most esteemed birds weren't always the top hunters, but those with the most striking feathers or the largest cost. The ultimate prize falcon was the white gerfalcon, which was so uncommon and costly that it was said only a king could purchase one. In fact, the Holy Roman Emperor Frederick II, a medieval falconry trendsetter, was so fixated on his birds that he authored an entire volume on the topic and was known to take his falcons to religious services with him perched on his arm, which must have led to some highly diverting homilies. But while Frederick and his winged companions were attracting attention at worship, his contemporary Kublai Khan, grandson of the notorious Genghis and leader of the Mongol Empire at its peak, was employing falconry for more utilitarian reasons. Specifically, training his birds to attack opposing troops in combat. That's correct. The Mongols weren't satisfied with merely conquering most of the known world from horseback. They had to involve their birds in the fight as well. Kublai Khan was reported to possess a formidable group of falcons, eagles, and other raptors that he utilized as a kind of plumed aerial unit, dispatching them to assault his foes and even deliver communications among his distant forces. And you thought messenger pigeons were remarkable. But perhaps the most renowned falconry enthusiast of the Middle Ages was a woman who suffered a tragic conclusion while doing what she cherished. Mary of Burgundy, daughter of the incredibly rich and mighty Charles the Bold, Duke of Burgundy, was a dedicated follower of hawking from her youth. Born in Brussels in 1457, Mary was the heir to the extensive Duchy of Burgundy, a land extending from the Low Countries to Switzerland that was famous for its luxury, culture, and knightly traditions. But while other aristocratic women were happy to remain in their chambers sewing and chatting, Mary was in the fields with her birds, hawking from sunrise to sunset. She was said to have a special affection for merlins, small, aggressive falcons valued for their quickness and velocity in chasing targets. Mary was so committed to her birds that she even had a specially designed saddle created with a unique perch on the front so she could ride with her falcon prepared. But Mary's passion for falconry would lead to her downfall. In 1482, at only 25 years old, Mary was out hawking with her attendants when her horse tripped and tossed her to the earth. She endured a serious back wound and passed away shortly after, throwing her duchy into a succession dispute and political chaos. It was a heartbreaking conclusion for a lively young woman who represented the knightly principles of her era, a talented rider, a devoted supporter of the arts, and a ruler who boldly protected her territories from the ambitious reach of France. Today, Mary is recalled as an icon of the strength and vulnerability of medieval femininity, a duchess who governed independently, but whose existence was ended by a harsh turn of destiny. As for her treasured birds, they probably flew to new owners, their straps dangling like a last goodbye to the woman who had cherished them so intensely during her life. But Mary's reputation as a falconer endures, a proof of the lasting appeal of a pursuit that combined ability, swiftness, and a hint of fierce beauty into one exhilarating, if fatal, activity. So, there you have it. A peek into the exciting realm of medieval falconry, where birds were symbols of status, weapons in war, and faithful partners all combined in one intense plumed form. It's a long way from the pet budgies and cockatiels we have now. But then, everything in the Middle Ages was a bit more extreme. From the soaring cathedrals to the 10-foot-long poulains, even the companions were extravagant. From falconry to feasting, hunting to hawking, chivalry to the pursuit, the upper class of medieval Europe definitely knew how to keep themselves occupied between all the battling and fortune-building. But rest assured, it wasn't all enjoyment and games for the feudal upper crust. The impoverished peasants who performed all the real labor had their modest pleasures too, like avoiding the plague and sometimes having sufficient food. Right. Let's shift from the elite hunters and their lethal pets to examine the more grounded amusements of the everyday people. And no, I don't simply mean observing the nearby lord pass by in his splendor and daydreaming about consuming his horse. Fair days offered a pleasant break from the everyday work and troubles of medieval existence. Throughout Europe, from grand London to small hamlets, individuals anticipated unique holidays and holy days that promised eating, celebration, and amazement. One of the most lively and eagerly awaited was Carnival, the excessive time before the strict abstinence of Lent. Carnival events trace back to old pagan rites, but in the Middle Ages, they gained a clearly Christian tone while maintaining a sense of playfulness and enigma. For a short period, the usual structure of society was flipped upside down. Perhaps no leaders adopted the essence of Carnival with as much zeal as the Dukes of Burgundy in the 15th century. The Burgundian court was famous across Europe for its luxury, creativity, and display, and the Duke held nothing back for Mardi Gras. In 1454, Duke Philip the Good organized a spectacular event in the Flemish city of Lille that was recalled for decades against an enchanting setting of lights, wall hangings, and blossoms. Aristocrats dressed in sumptuous outfits marched through the avenues joined by players, parading troops with spears and ornate wagons showing sacred and legendary scenes. Crowds of ordinary people pushed for a view of the unusual animals like camels and elephants in Philip's collection. Springs poured wine as spectators rushed to fill their vessels. Singers and writers presented songs praising the Duke's bravery and strength. And as darkness arrived, a luxurious dinner started in the Duke's residence, offering a bewildering selection of treats like cooked peacock, sugared flowers, and candy figures. The peak occurred when Philip entered grandly attired as a forester, the flame light shining on his golden fabric. Before the gathered elite, he seriously promised to bear the cross and set out on a crusade to retake Constantinople from the Turks, a commitment called the Feast of the Pheasant. Though Philip never truly carried out this pledge, his carnival promise illustrated the fantastical magnificence of Burgundy at its zenith. Further north in England, a somewhat distinct carnival practice developed: the selection of boy bishops. In a fun reversal of religious structure, young lads were picked to conduct holy services and even give a talk before the adult priests on Holy Innocents' Day. This unusual habit, noted as early as the 10th century, grew common and was observed in many of England's major cathedrals and abbeys. One can only picture the amused expressions of the congregants as a shyly smiling boy delivered a high-pitched speech, clothed in oversized bishop's garments and hat. More energetic was the comparable custom of naming a lord of misrule, a pretend monarch who oversaw the Feast of Fools and other carnival festivities. Typically acted by a young commoner, this cheeky persona was responsible for sparking trouble and amusement, flipping norms around. The Lord of Misrule acted as a host, guiding lines of dressed-up celebrants, starting comedic performances that mocked the formality of royal courts, and even issuing cheeky orders that lightly mocked political leaders. Some misrule commands could become quite daring. One documented case from the Abbey of Unreason in Scotland boldly declared in the name of high drunkenness that monks should sit for prayers, drink only ale, and make better cheer than ever before. Of course, the real officials usually watched such behaviors cautiously, lest the nonsense spiral out of control. There were occasional suppressions by critical bishops or city elders, but overall, a few days of absurdity and a loud mockery offered a necessary release in the strict order of medieval society. While Carnival delivered a surge of celebration in late winter, other events were scattered across the medieval year. The midsummer celebration of St. John the Baptist included fires, dancing, and romantic predictions in many places. Young ladies floated wreaths with lights on waterways, aiming to gather hints about their future spouses from the glowing flames. If a girl's wreath sank, it was a bad omen that she would not wed that year. Scented plants like rosemary and St. John's wort were collected and scattered around houses to repel bad spirits. In an interesting blend of pagan and Christian customs, The enchanted herbs were then preserved and burned in the Yule log at Christmas. Speaking of enchanted plants, the fall feast of St. Michael highlighted a perhaps unexpected star, the simple carrot. Though an everyday vegetable today, carrots were a relative newness in the Middle Ages after arriving via Moorish Spain. Their sweet taste and bright orange hue made them a prized treat. At Michaelmas, women seeking a spouse were recommended to rest with a carrot under their pillow and say, "Saint Michael, smell, my lover, you know well. By dreams, let me see the youth that I shall marry." Apparently, sleeping with a root vegetable was quite the love charm. If visions of the right man didn't show up, at least the woman woke to a convenient treat. Beyond holy days, every community and settlement had its own local gatherings marking occasions like the anniversary of the local church's dedication or the birth of a royal child. Though less grand than flashy tournaments or courtly dinners, these neighborhood events built a sense of unity and escape from routine hardship. Imagine the thrill building in a quiet English village as folks assembled for the festival of the church's patron saint. The aroma of cooking meat drifted on the air as an ox rotated on a spit over snapping flames. Boys and girls flirted and danced around a cheerfully adorned maypole to the sound of a violin and percussion. Cheerful wives chatted and laughed as they hung strings of wild blooms. Energetic young men proved their strength in shooting and grappling matches. A feeling of camaraderie spread along with the casks of bubbly ale supplied by the local official. For at least one day, the grueling routine of sowing and harvesting could be set aside. Even in the smallest villages, a beloved part of festivals was the mystery plays. These basic dramas recreated tales from the Bible and the stories of saints and martyrs. In an era before common reading ability, mystery plays made spiritual stories available to regular folks and gave uncommon chances for artistic outlet. Members of different craft groups, the butchers, the bakers, the candlestick makers, took charge of producing various scenes that fit their trade. So the shipwrights might enact Noah's Ark, the winemakers the wedding at Cana, and so on. The plays happened on carts turned into temporary platforms that moved through the town, pausing at set spots to act out each part. Though the content was holy, that didn't stop some accidentally funny instances. Since effects were fairly basic, angels used chicken feathers attached to a white garment. Flaming entrances to hell made of red painted material open to accept the condemned. An actor as Herod might yell and storm only to have his false beard caught on his crown. In the well-known Second Shepherd's play, a thief attempting to conceal a stolen lamb from the wary shepherds passes it off as a new baby. The mistaken identity comedy must have had viewers laughing hard. One can envision a diligent peasant staring in joy as Noah argued with his outspoken wife, maybe seeing his own domestic arguments. Laughter, even at somewhat irreverent humor, offered a soothing relief for lives that could often be nasty, brutish, and short. For a few hours full of joy, the strict teachings of the church took a back seat to pure riotous amusement. Kings and commoners alike participated in the shared release of carnival fun, midsummer joy, and homemade harvest cheer. So when your days seem dull and your mood drops, just think of those determined medieval celebrants. With a candle-lit wreath, a sugary figure, or a lamb pretending to be the baby Jesus, they found ways to rejoice in the hardest times. Weary serfs and haughty dukes alike treasured their hard-earned holidays. perhaps some similar nonsense is called for. Grab a carrot for your pillow and call upon the power of St. Michael's love magic. Name a friend as Lord of Misrule and issue some pretend orders. A little festive silliness might be just the boost a difficult day requires. And with that playful suggestion, I bid you good night, fair listener. May your dreams be filled with noble knights and naughty jesters, merry maypoles and mysterious miracle plays. For in sleep, as in laughter, the cares of the world melt away. Until next time, rest you merry, one and all. Thank you for that. You're right. Glucose gambling houses were quite a sensation when they debuted in medieval Venice. Though the exact details are lost to history, most scholars agree these were some of the earliest dedicated gambling parlors in Europe. Venetians, with their love of games and wagers, enthusiastically embraced these new establishments. Picture the scene. You stroll through the winding cobblestone streets of Venice. Narrow buildings rising up on either side, laundry strung between windows. The air is thick with the brine of the canals and the sizzle of frying seafood. Rounding a corner, you come upon an elaborately painted door, the entrance to the Gluckhaus. Laughter and clinking of goblets issues from within. Passing through the doorway, you enter a hazy den of merriment and vice. Gamblers crowd around tables, the strain of wins and losses playing across their faces in the flickering candlelight. A trio of minstrels picks out a jaunty tune in the corner. Servers wind through the throng, carrying trays of wine and plates of antipasti. Making your way to one of the tables, you survey the game in progress. Funny-looking dice carved from animal bones rattle in a shooter's hand. Wooden discs serving as betting markers are piled haphazardly. The gamblers, noblemen, and merchants alike cajole each other and curse the dice in colorful Venetian slang. As a new round begins, a hush falls over the gamblers. The shooter gives the dice a blow for luck and casts them clattering across the table. Cheers erupt as the dice come to rest, revealing a winning roll. Coins are scooped toward the lucky few as the losers groan. You catch the eye of a grizzled, one-eyed gambler, his face a map of hard living. He shoots you a gap-toothed grin. "Sit down, friend, and test your luck," he rasps, gesturing to an empty chair. Fickle Mistress Fortuna calls. Tossing caution to the wind, you slide into the seat and take up the dice. A new player has entered the game at the Gluckhaus. Ah, but we can't spend all night carousing in this den of chance, as enticing as that might seem. The scene fades into the shadows as we take our leave of the jolly Gluckhaus. So many other medieval divertissements still beckon us onward. But it's remarkable to think that the gambling spirit that animated those Venetian dice players is still very much alive today, even if the games have changed. And so we turn from the rattle of dice to the thunder of hoofbeats. The medieval tournament ground calls for noble knights and enthusiastic common folk alike. Nothing could match the pageantry and excitement of a grand tournament. It was a chance for skilled warriors to test their mettle and for spectators to marvel at displays of martial prowess. One of the most celebrated knights of the tournament circuit was William Marshall, a man who rose from humble origins to become renowned as the greatest knight in Christendom. Marshall was the youngest son of a minor English nobleman, but his skill with the lance and sword would make him a legend. In his youth, Marshall was sent to Normandy to train in the arts of knighthood. He proved a quick study with a natural gift for the bruising physicality of mounted combat. Soon, he was traveling the tournament circuit as a roving knight-errant, making a name for himself with his victories. Imagine the scene as Marshall arrives at a tournament ground. A broad field bustling with activity under a bright blue sky. Gay-colored tents and pavilions surround the list field where the jousting will take place. Pennants snap in the breeze, each one emblazoned with the coat of arms of a participating knight. The thunder of hoofbeats announces a column of armored knights riding onto the field, Marshall among them. His armor is unadorned, workmanlike. He has no need for frippery. The knights take their places at either end of the list, couching their lances and preparing to charge. A hush falls over the crowd as a herald steps forth and begins announcing the combatants with a trumpet fanfare. The noble ladies wave their favors to their chosen champions. Then, at a signal from the master of ceremonies, the knights spur their horses into a gallop. Lances lower into place as the knights hurtle towards each other, sun glinting off their armor. With a titanic crash, they collide in the center of the list. Lances shatter in explosions of splinters. A knight tumbles from his saddle, his armor clanging as he hits the ground. But Marshall keeps his seat, expertly guiding his steed to the end of the list. Squires scurry to supply him with a fresh lance. He wheels about and readies himself for the next pass. This display of skill and bravery is what has won Marshall such renown on the tournament fields of Europe. As the day wears on, Marshall bests challenger after challenger. The crowd applauds his gallantry and prowess. Some onlookers even dash out to scoop up pieces of his shattered lances as souvenirs. By the end of the tournament, Marshall is declared the champion. He dips his lance to the noble lord hosting the event as the crowd cheers. With his string of tournament victories and reputation for honesty and loyalty, William Marshall caught the eye of some powerful patrons. He would go on to serve as a household knight for Eleanor of Aquitaine and tournament captain for her son, Henry the young king. Even as he entered the service of the Plantagenet royal family, Marshall still found time to compete in tournaments. In 1177, he journeyed to Paris to participate in a grand tournament, a melee hosted by the French crown. After handily defeating all comers, Marshall was set to face off against the king's kinsman. But the opponent's lackluster skill was no match for Marshall. The crowds began to jeer and heckle the hapless French knight. Seeking to salvage his kinsman's dignity, the king begged Marshall to throw the match. True to his reputation for loyalty, Marshall dutifully took a dive, allowing himself to be flung from his horse. The French knight was allowed to save face, but no one was fooled. Marshall's chivalry and honor only burnished his legend. He would go on to serve as tutor in chivalry to Henry the young king, and earn fame defending Henry's claim to the throne in the Great Rebellion of 1173. Marshall's tournament exploits were the making of his reputation, but they were far from the end of his story. His integrity and battle prowess would see him become a respected statesman, regent, and advisor to no less than 5 English kings. But those are tales for another time. For now, the shadows lengthen over the tournament ground as the day's final match comes to an end. The crowds begin to disperse back to their pavilions, and the knights retire to their tents to be helped out of their armor by their squires. blacksmiths begin the task of hammering dents out of helms and breastplates by firelight. The tournament has been a rousing spectacle, a welcome jolt of excitement for commoners and nobles alike. In a time when warfare was grim and all too common, the tournament allowed knights to test their skills in a more controlled setting. It was a chance for glory, fanfare, and gallantry. The tournament grounds grow quiet as night settles in and the revelers seek their beds. But the glow of the day's excitement lingers, a happy memory to revisit in times of drudgery or hardship. In a medieval world that could often be brutal and harsh, the tournament was a cherished escape into pageantry and sport. But the call of the tournament is only one of many tantalizing amusements drawing us onward. The flicker of the Renaissance is still only a distant glow on the horizon. There are centuries of medieval entertainments yet to explore, each a window into the dreams and pastimes of a long-ago world. Our journey through the Middle Ages continues. But for now, the candles gutter low, and the velvet night wraps us in its embrace. Surely it is time for these weary old bones to seek the comfort of bed and pillow. There will be more wild medieval tales to spin upon the morrow. So I bid you good night, gentle listener. May your slumber be easy and your dreams sweet, untainted by the clang and clamor of the tournament field. Rest now, and on the morrow, our quest for medieval merriment shall resume with vigor renewed. Until then, I remain your humble guide, the chronicler of centuries past. Adieu. In the harsh and often short lives of medieval peasants, entertainment provided a rare respite from back-breaking toil and the ever-present specter of disease, famine, and violence. While the nobility had the leisure and wealth to indulge in more refined and extravagant amusements, even the lowliest serfs found ways to infuse some merriment into their meager existence. One of the simplest yet most beloved peasant pastimes was dancing. On feast days and holidays, villagers would gather to perform lively jigs, reels, and circle dances accompanied by whatever makeshift instruments they could muster. Pipes, drums, fiddles played by itinerant minstrels if they were lucky. There was little in the way of formal steps or choreography. These dances were free-form expressions of pure joy and communal celebration. For a few precious moments, the worries of the working-day world could be forgotten in a whirl of flailing limbs and stomping feet. Another perennially popular diversion was the humble game of bowls. All that was needed was a relatively flat patch of ground and some rounded stones or wooden balls. Players would take turns tossing their balls, aiming to land them as close as possible to a smaller target ball called the jack or kitty. It was a game that could be enjoyed by young and old alike, men and women, making it a staple of village greens and taverns across Europe. Speaking of taverns, these establishments were the closest thing most medieval peasants had to an entertainment venue. After a long day in the fields, men would gather to quaff ale, swap stories, sing bawdy songs, and perhaps engage in some friendly wagering on dice or card games. Gambling with dice had been popular since ancient Roman times, and the medieval version wasn't much different. Simply toss the dice and hope that your number comes up. Not exactly Vegas, but it added an extra thrill to the night's revelry. Of course, peasant fun couldn't hold a candle to the opulent amusements enjoyed by the nobility. Imagine, if you will, the splendor of a grand tournament held by a wealthy lord. Knights in gleaming armor astride snorting steeds, vividly colorful banners snapping in the breeze. The thunder of hooves and the crash of lances as the champions vied for glory and riches before a cheering crowd. It was like a blockbuster sporting event and a rock concert rolled into one. But even for the nobility, life wasn't all jousts and banquets. In a world where warfare was the order of the day, tournaments served as a way for knights to hone their combat skills. As the saying goes, next to war, there is nothing more like war than a tournament. Training for these mock battles began in childhood with young pages and squires, learning the arts of swordplay, lancing, and horsemanship under the tutelage of veteran knights. One of the most famous of these knightly tutors was William Marshall, who rose from humble origins to become the greatest tournament champion of his age and a trusted advisor to no less than 5 English kings. Born in 1147 to a minor noble family, William was given to the king as a hostage when he was just 5 years old, as surety for his father's good behavior. When his father failed to keep his word, the king threatened to have young William catapulted over the castle walls to his death. But fortunately for William and for England, the king's cruel bluff was never called. The boy was spared and sent to Normandy to receive a proper knightly education. There he excelled in the martial arts, quickly making a name for himself on the tournament circuit. His skill with a lance was unmatched. He once even managed to kill 3 adversaries with a single blow, impaling one through the chest and driving the splintered lance through his body into the 2 men behind him. Ouch. But William was more than just a brute in armor. He was also renowned for his honor, chivalry, and loyalty. When King Henry II's sons rebelled against their father, William remained steadfastly by the old king's side. And when Henry died a broken man, it was William who personally carried his body to be buried at Fontevraud Abbey. Such fealty did not go unrewarded. William went on to serve Henry's successors with equal distinction, acting as a chief advisor, diplomat, and military commander. By the time of his own death in 1219, he had amassed a vast fortune through tournament winnings and royal land grants. He was even made regent of England on behalf of the child king Henry III. Not bad for a boy who had once been dangled over the edge of a castle by his ankles. Of course, not every tournament had such lofty political stakes. Many were held simply for the sheer spectacle and sport of it all. The grandest of these extravaganzas could last for days or even weeks, drawing knights and spectators from across Europe. One such event was the tournament at Chalons in 1274, hosted by the Count of Chalons in the French region of Champagne. It was a lavish affair with over 300 knights in attendance. Among them were the cream of European chivalry, including the dashing Edward, Prince of Wales, later King Edward I of England. But what began as a friendly competition soon took a turn for the scandalous. During a joust, Edward's lance struck the Count of Chalons with such force that it knocked him clear off his horse. Enraged, the Count accused the prince of unchivalrous conduct and demanded an apology. But Edward was having none of it. In a fit of youthful bravado, he proclaimed, "No Frenchman shall have my submission," and stormed out of the tournament with his entourage in tow. The incensed Count vowed revenge, but cooler heads eventually prevailed. A truce was brokered, and Edward went on to compete in the tournament, winning accolades for his prowess. But the incident left a lingering bad taste and soured relations between the English and French courts. Such diplomatic tensions were not uncommon in the world of medieval tournaments. These events weren't just about athletic glory. They were also a way for nobles to flaunt their wealth, power, and prestige. A well-run tournament could cement a lord's reputation and influence, attracting allies and intimidating rivals. Conversely, a poorly managed or sparsely attended affair could be a humiliating blow to a noble's standing. No one understood this better than René of Anjou, the 15th century French duke and king who was nicknamed the Good for his reputation as a just and enlightened ruler. René was a true Renaissance man, a skilled knight, a patron of the arts, and a master at the game of courtly politics. He knew that a dazzling tournament could be a powerful tool for winning hearts and minds. In 1446, René staged a grand tournament at his capital of Nancy that was unlike anything the world had ever seen. Dubbed the Pas de la Bergère, or Shepherdess's Dance, it was a whimsical blend of chivalric pageantry and theatrics inspired by the pastoral romance of the Middle Ages. Knights dressed as shepherds and shepherdesses competing not just in jousts, but in poetry contests, song and dance numbers, and even sheep-herding trials using real livestock. It was all highly allegorical. Of course, the shepherdess represented the virtues of courtly love which the knights would strive to defend and embody. But it was also a showcase for the wealth and sophistication of René's court. The lavish costumes, elaborate sets, and exotic animals on display sent a clear message. Anjou was a cultural force to be reckoned with. The highlight of the tournament was the pas d'armes, or passage of arms, in which daring knights would attempt to cross a mock fortress bridge defended by René and his hand-picked champions. It was a feat of arms straight out of Arthurian legend, meant to evoke the daunting perils and rewards of the chivalric quest. For days, the cream of European knighthood tried and failed to best René's team, much to the delight of the crowd. The Duke himself, dressed in resplendent gold armor, held the bridge like a latter-day Lancelot. In the end, it was his own brother-in-law, the dashing Fairy de Lorraine, who finally managed to unhorse René and seize the prize. But the real winner was René himself. The Pas de la Bergère was a public relations coup, establishing Anjou as a center of culture and chivalry. It also cemented René's personal reputation as a model of kingly virtue, a deft mixer of war and courtliness. His subjects hailed him as a new King Arthur, the once and future king of their dreams. Alas, not every ruler could live up to such lofty ideals. In 1274, a very different sort of monarch mounted the throne of England. Edward I, the same hot-headed prince who had stormed out of the tournament at Chalons all those years ago. Edward was a fierce and canny warrior king, more interested in conquering Wales and Scotland than in playing shepherd. He embodied the harsher realities of medieval kingship, where might made right, and chivalry was often just a thin veneer over the naked exercise of power. But even Edward recognized the value of a well-staged spectacle. In 1306, he held a massive tournament at Winchester to celebrate the knighting of his son, the future Edward II. Over 500 knights from across Europe attended, making it one of the largest chivalric gatherings of the Middle Ages. The festivities kicked off with a grand procession through the streets of Winchester led by the guest of honor himself. Young Edward, just 22 years old, cut a dashing figure in his gilded armor, his surcoat emblazoned with the 3 lions of England. Behind him rode a glittering cavalcade of knights and nobles, their colorful banners fluttering in the breeze. At the tournament grounds, a makeshift village of tents and pavilions had sprung up to accommodate the crowds. Vendors hawked everything from roasted meats to holy relics, while minstrels and acrobats entertained the masses. It was like a cross between a state fair and a Super Bowl tailgate party. But the real action was on the tournament field. For 3 days, the knights clashed in a dizzying array of martial contests. Jousts, melees, mounted combat with swords and maces. The thunder of hooves and the clang of steel echoed across the grounds, whipping the spectators into a frenzy. Fortunes and reputations were made and lost on the tilt yard. One young knight in particular stood out from the pack. The dashing Piers Gaveston, a childhood friend and favorite of Prince Edward. Piers was a skilled jouster and a born showman with a flair for the dramatic both on and off the field. He and Edward made a striking pair, 2 golden boys reveling in their youth and prowess. But their bond would prove to be a double-edged sword. When Edward II came to the throne a few years later, he showered Piers with lands, titles, and honors, provoking the ire of the other nobles. The arrogant young Gascon was seen as an upstart, a corrupter of the king who needed to be taken down a peg. In 1312, the tensions finally boiled over. A baronial faction led by Edward's cousin Thomas of Lancaster seized Piers and had him beheaded on the grounds of Blacklow Hill. It was a shocking act of lèse-majesté, a direct challenge to Edward's royal authority, but it was also a sign of the changing times. The age of chivalry was giving way to the cold calculations of realpolitik. Edward never forgot the loss of his beloved companion. For the rest of his reign, he fought an ultimately losing battle to assert his will over his fractious nobility. In the end, he was deposed by his own wife and son, meeting a grim fate in the dungeons of Berkeley Castle. It was an ignominious end for a king who had once been the brightest star of the tournament circuit. But while the world of chivalry was fading, the grand tournaments of old still lived on in the popular imagination. Nowhere was this more evident than in the elaborate round tables staged by Edward III in the mid-14th century. These events were a conscious throwback to the legendary court of King Arthur, complete with jousting, feasting, and Arthurian-themed pageantry. The most famous of these was held at Windsor Castle in 1344 to celebrate the founding of Edward's new chivalric order, the Order of the Garter. According to legend, the order was inspired by an incident at a ball when Edward's mistress, the Countess of Salisbury, dropped her garter on the dance floor. Gallantly picking it up, Edward tied it around his own leg, declaring, "Honi soit qui mal y pense." Roughly, shame on anyone who thinks ill of this. The phrase became the motto of the order, which still exists to this day. But the real purpose of the Order of the Garter was to bind England's leading nobles to the crown, creating a corps of loyal knights who could help Edward project his power at home and abroad. It was a shrewd move, one that played on the lingering prestige and mystique of the Arthurian legends. By styling himself as a new King Arthur, Edward was tapping into a deep well of chivalric nostalgia. The Round Table Tournament at Windsor was a suitably grandiose affair. A massive wooden grandstand was erected in the shape of a circular castle with towers and battlements bristling with heraldic banners. In the center was a model of the fabled Round Table itself, around which sat Edward and his new garter knights resplendent in their blue velvet robes and golden chains. For 5 days, the knights jousted and feasted, reenacting the legendary exploits of Arthur and his court. They even staged a mock siege of the Castle of Maidens, with Edward himself leading the charge to rescue the damsels in distress played by the Queen and her ladies-in-waiting. It was all highly theatrical, a piece of living mythopoeia. But amid the pageantry and spectacle, there was a darker undercurrent. Just a few months earlier, Edward had executed 14 of his own barons for treason, including several who had been involved in the death of Piers Gaveston. The Round Table Tournament was in part an effort to paper over these divisions, to create a facade of chivalric unity. In the end, though, the real world could not be kept at bay forever. Even as Edward and his knights played at being Arthur and Lancelot, the Black Death was creeping across Europe, a grim reaper that would claim millions of lives and shatter the old feudal order. The age of chivalry was drawing to a close, and a new, harsher era was dawning. But for a brief, shining moment, the grand tournaments of old had brought a touch of Camelot to the muddy fields of medieval England. They were a glorious anachronism, a last hurrah for a dying way of life. And while the world they represented may have been deeply flawed, there was still something undeniably alluring about their pageantry and romance. So tonight, as you drift off to sleep, let your mind wander back to those distant days of yore. Picture the colorful tents and pavilions, the glittering armor and heraldic banners. Hear the thunder of hooves and the roar of the crowd, the twang of lutes and the jingle of bells. Imagine yourself as a knight or lady caught up in the swirl of chivalric intrigue and courtly love. And remember that even in the darkest of times, people have always found ways to come together and celebrate the joys of life. Whether it was through grand tournaments or simple village dances, our ancestors knew the value of a good party. So, let us take a page from their book and find our own ways to make merry and chase away the shadows. Good night, dear listener, and may your dreams be filled with the stuff of legends. Now, if we step back from the tilt yard and into the great halls of medieval castles, we find ourselves in the sumptuous world of courtly feasts and banquets. These were not just meals, but full-blown sensory extravaganzas designed to showcase the wealth, power, and sophistication of the host. The grandest of these affairs could last for days or even weeks with a dizzying array of dishes, entertainments, and distractions. The feast given by King Charles V of France in 1378 to celebrate the Holy Roman Emperor's visit reportedly featured over 50 courses, including such delicacies as roasted peacocks redressed in their own plumage and a pie filled with live birds that burst forth in song when the crust was cut. But even a more modest noble feast was a sight to behold. Picture a great hall decked out in rich tapestries and hangings with trestle tables groaning under the weight of silver platters and golden goblets. At the head table sits the lord and lady of the castle, surrounded by their most honored guests and retainers. Down the center of the hall stretches a long table flanked by benches for the lesser nobles and gentry. They are seated in strict order of precedence with the most highborn nearest the Lord's table. The salt cellar, a large ornate vessel for holding salt, marks the dividing line between the upper and lower ranks. To be seated below the salt was a sign of inferior status. As the guests take their seats, a procession of servants enters bearing the first course, perhaps a subtlety or entremet, an elaborate edible sculpture meant to amuse and impress. It might take the continuing the script. The merry entertainments and feasts of the nobles may have offered a welcome diversion from medieval life's hardships. But for the majority of people, the simple joys of seasonal festivals and fairs were often the highlight of the year. These special occasions punctuated the calendar, giving commoners a much-needed break from the daily toil and drudgery that filled most of their days. Perhaps the most exuberant and rambunctious of these celebrations was Carnival, the indulgent period of feasting and revelry that preceded the austere fasting of Lent. With roots stretching back to ancient pagan traditions, Carnival was a time when the normal rules and hierarchies of society were temporarily suspended. For a few fleeting days, the world turned upside down as people donned masks and costumes, parading through the streets in a joyous explosion of music, dancing, and mischief. Carnival reached its height in the grand cities of medieval Europe, where the festivities often lasted for weeks and were marked by lavish public spectacles and banquets. In the 15th century, the opulent dukes of Burgundy were particularly renowned for their decadent Mardi Gras celebrations. These sumptuous affairs unfolded in their capital of Dijon as extravagantly costumed nobles and citizens alike thronged the streets indulging in rich food, fine wine, and unbridled merrymaking. One can only imagine the sights, sounds, and smells that would have greeted a visitor to Dijon during the peak of Carnival. Minstrels and troubadours filled the air with lively tunes, while acrobats and jugglers performed daring feats to the delight of the crowds. Amidst it all, the tantalizing scent of roasting meats and sweet pastries wafted from the numerous stalls and vendors, tempting revelers with their savory wares. As night fell, the Duke's palace would blaze with the light of 1,000 candles as the nobility gathered for a magnificent masked ball. Lords and ladies, their identities concealed behind colorful disguises, twirled and spun to the strains of a merry tune. For one enchanted evening, the cares and burdens of rank and responsibility could be forgotten as all gave themselves over to the joys of music, dance, and good company. Yet, even as the nobility celebrated in grand style, the common folk also found their own ways to revel in the carnival spirit. One of the most popular and enduring traditions was the election of a mock king or lord of misrule to preside over the festivities. This mischievous figure, usually a peasant or lowly cleric, was appointed to lead the people in a playful parody of the official order. In many towns, the lord of misrule held court in the local tavern, issuing ridiculous proclamations and demanding that his subjects perform outrageous feats and stunts for his amusement. It was a time when the humble could poke fun at the mighty with bawdy songs and satirical skits that lampoon the follies and vices of those in power. Another beloved carnival custom was the Feast of Fools, an irreverent celebration in which young choir boys and lowly priests were temporarily elevated to positions of authority within the church. In a complete inversion of the normal hierarchy, a boy bishop was elected to lead the revels, conducting absurd mock masses and blessing the congregation with good-natured japes and jokes. While church leaders frequently tried to suppress these subversive rituals, fearing they would undermine the sanctity and solemnity of religious life, the common people embraced them wholeheartedly. For a few precious days, the heavy yoke of piety and obedience could be cast aside as the lowly delighted in turning the tables on their betters. Of course, not all medieval festivities were quite so unruly or irreverent. Trade fairs in particular served a more practical purpose, bringing together merchants and craftsmen from far and wide to buy, sell, and exchange their wares. These bustling gatherings were often the economic and social lifeblood of medieval towns, drawing visitors from across the land. One of the largest and most renowned of these fairs was the Stourbridge Fair, held each September on the banks of the River Cam in the English town of Cambridge. Established in the 12th century and granted a formal charter by King John in 1211, Stourbridge Fair grew to become a commercial hub of international significance, attracting traders from as far afield as the Byzantine Empire and the Islamic world. For 3 weeks each year, the normally sleepy meadows outside Cambridge were transformed into a vast tented city with countless stalls and booths, selling everything from fine textiles and precious spices to livestock and agricultural tools. Merchants from Germany, Italy, and Flanders jostled alongside local farmers and craftsmen, haggling over prices and striking deals in a bewildering array of languages and dialects. Yet Stourbridge Fair was much more than just a place of business. It was also a vital social gathering, a chance for people to come together, share news and gossip, and enjoy a welcome break from the isolation and monotony of medieval life. Amidst the serious trade negotiations, there was also plenty of time for laughter, storytelling, and camaraderie. Wandering minstrels and acrobats mingled with the crowds, entertaining the fairgoers with their songs, jests, and feats of daring. Puppet shows and mystery plays performed on makeshift stages brought the stories of the Bible and the lives of the saints to vivid life, captivating audiences with their colorful pageantry and dramatic flair. As the sun began to set over the fair's final days, the weary merchants would pack up their unsold goods and begin the long journey home, their purses hopefully a bit heavier, and their hearts a bit lighter. For the locals, too, the fair's end was a bittersweet moment as the excitement and novelty of the past weeks gave way to the familiar rhythms of daily life. But the memories of the fair would linger long after the last tent was struck and the last coin changed hands. In the dark winter months to come, as people huddled around their hearths, they would reminisce about the wonders they had seen, the exotic tales they had heard, and the fleeting friendships they had made. And they would count the days until the fair returned once more, bringing with it the promise of novelty, companionship, and the chance to leave their cares behind, if only for a little while. In many ways, these fairs and festivals were more than just a diversion or a break from the hardships of medieval life. They were a vital reminder of the resilience and joy of the human spirit, a testament to people's ability to find moments of happiness and connection, even in the face of great adversity. So perhaps when we look back on the revelries and pastimes of the Middle Ages, we should not view them merely as curious historical oddities or quaint glimpses into a distant past. Rather, We should see in them a reflection of our own deep-seated need for community, for shared experiences, and for the fleeting magic of a world transformed, if only for a day. And as we drift off to sleep, our minds still filled with visions of colorful carnivals and bustling fairgrounds, we might just find ourselves dreaming of a time when life's simple pleasures were enough to make the heart sing. For in the end, the wild things that medieval people did for fun may not have been so very different from the things that bring us joy and laughter today. So let us all take a moment to raise our imaginary glass to the lords of misrule and the boy bishops, to the minstrels and the merchants, and to all those long-ago revelers who knew that even in the darkest of times there is always room for a bit of merriment and mirth. May their joyful spirits live on in our own hearts. And may we always remember to make time for the simple pleasures that make life worth living. And with that, my dear listeners, we come to the end of our journey through the wild and wonderful world of medieval pastimes. I hope you've enjoyed this whimsical tour through history as much as I've enjoyed sharing it with you. And I hope that as you drift off to sleep, your dreams will be filled not with the cares and worries of the present day, but with the laughter and joy of a time long past. So until next time, I bid you all a fond good night and sweet dreams of carnival kings and fair day wonders. May the coming day bring you all the happiness and delight of a medieval festival. And may you find your own small moments of revelry and mirth wherever life may lead you. Script ends. Let's now turn our attention to one of the most peculiar yet popular pastimes of the medieval era: hunting and hawking. For the nobility, the pursuit of wild game was not merely a means of putting food on the table, but an elaborate ritual imbued with deep symbolic meaning. A successful hunt was seen as a demonstration of masculine prowess, a way for lords to bond with their peers, and even a metaphor for the triumph of order over the chaos of the natural world. But perhaps no one embodied the spirit of the medieval huntress quite like Mary of Burgundy. Born into the immensely wealthy House of Valois in 1457, Mary was the only child of Charles the Bold, the pugnacious Duke of Burgundy. With her father often away waging war, Mary grew up under the strong influence of her mother, Isabella of Bourbon, who instilled in her a lifelong passion for hunting and falconry. Contemporary accounts describe Mary as a lively, free-spirited tomboy equally at home in the saddle or the great hall. She scandalized the Burgundian court by insisting on riding astride like a man rather than demurely side-saddle. Her favorite horse was named Moreau, and the two were inseparable companions. Mary's education was remarkably well-rounded for a woman of her time. In addition to needlework, dancing, and music, she learned horsemanship, archery, and how to train a falcon. By all accounts, Mary was a crack shot with a bow and a skilled huntress. One chronicle boasts that she could shoot a hare at full gallop. Her enthusiasm for the hunt was so great that she often neglected other duties. A court scribe laments how council meetings were perpetually delayed because Mary was off somewhere with her beloved birds and dogs. Mary's prized falcons were lavished with the finest accoutrements befitting their royal status. Their jesses, the leather straps used to tether them, were made of silk brocade or Moroccan leather studded with gemstones. The birds' hoods, used to keep them calm, were intricately embroidered with gold and silver thread and adorned with tassels and bells. Some hoods were even topped with miniature crowns. Mary employed a small army of falconers, hunters, and kennelmen to assist in her sport. Chief among them was her master of game, who oversaw the care and training of her precious birds and planned the logistics of each hunt. He ensured the mews, the building where the hawks were housed, was immaculate, and that each bird was fed its proper diet of fresh meat. Like most nobles, Mary practiced the great hunt on horseback, chasing deer and boar with a pack of swift hounds through the dense forests. The Duke of Burgundy's hunting lodge at La Bergère was her favorite retreat. Nestled in a lush wood teeming with game, there Mary and her ladies would gather, dressed in rich green hunting cloaks, their hair bound up in golden nets beneath jaunty plumed caps. As the hunting party gathered, a chorus of barking would fill the misty morning air. The dog handlers would struggle to control the eager hounds who strained at their leashes, their noses twitching for the scent of their quarry. The hunters carried an assortment of weapons: spears for boar, bows for deer, and a wood knife for dispatching the prey. With a blast of the hunting horn, they were off thundering through the forest with Mary leading the charge, her cheeks flushed with excitement. Witnessing her in the heat of the chase, you could almost forget she was a royal princess destined to wed and rule. In those fleeting moments, she was just Mary, the fierce huntress of Burgundy, as wild and untamed as the stag. But for all her skill and courage, no hunter can outrun fate. Mary's own story would be cut tragically short in 1482 when she was just 25 years old. In a terrible twist of irony, the Duchess who so loved to hunt would herself fall victim to a hunting accident. While pursuing her with her falcons near Bruges, Mary's spirited horse, Moreau, tripped and fell, throwing her violently to the ground. Mary suffered devastating internal injuries and lingered in agony for several days before finally succumbing. Her inconsolable husband, Maximilian, whom she had married for love, a rarity among royals, was at her bedside until the end. With her dying breath, Mary asked that her heart be entombed with her beloved Moreau. Mary of Burgundy's untimely death sent shockwaves across Europe and altered the political landscape as her rich territories passed to the Habsburgs. But among the people of Burgundy, she was remembered as a free spirit who lived and died pursuing her passions. Tales of Mary and her faithful Moreau riding to the hunt would be told for generations. A stirring tribute to a remarkable woman. While most medieval women did not enjoy Mary's freedoms, many did take part in the hunt in their own ways. Noble ladies often rode out with the hunters, not to chase game themselves, but to watch their men demonstrate their skill. They acted as cheerleaders from the sidelines, their cries of encouragement or derision echoing through the glades. Some high-born women kept their own hawks and even trained them, although on a much smaller scale than Mary's grand establishments. These pampered birds served more as living accessories than fierce hunters. A noble woman might carry her little Merlin on a velvet cushion, or perch it decoratively on her wrist as she processed through the garden. Its jesses and hood color-coordinated with her gown. Even the clergy got in on the hawking craze to the consternation of many. Bishops and abbots were some of the most ardent hunters, often neglecting their spiritual duties to spend hours in the field. Some even brought their birds to church, perching them behind the altar during Mass. One can only imagine the chaos that must have ensued when an agitated hawk decided to take flight in the middle of the service. For the lower classes, hunting was a more utilitarian affair, a way to supplement a meager diet with fresh game. Peasants might set snares for rabbits or hunt small birds with slingshots and nets, but they had to tread carefully. Severe penalties awaited any commoner caught poaching the king's deer. The unlucky few who ran afoul of the forest laws could expect to have their hands or ears cut off. So the next time you're enjoying a quiet walk in the woods, spare a thought for the colorful world of medieval hunting. Imagine the thunder of galloping hooves, the baying of the hounds, and the triumphant blast of the hunting horn echoing through the trees. And if you happen to spot a falcon wheeling overhead, perhaps it's the spirit of Mary of Burgundy, forever pursuing her quarry through an eternal forest. Moving on from the vivid world of medieval hunting, let's explore a very different kind of spectacle that captivated the masses. The antics of traveling entertainers to the delight of young and old alike. Minstrels, acrobats, jugglers, and animal trainers roamed the roads of Europe, bringing a splash of color and excitement wherever they went. But of all these wandering performers, perhaps none left as indelible a mark on history as a young 12th century Londoner named Thomas Becket. The son of a prosperous merchant, Thomas was a bright, charming lad with a quick wit and a flair for showmanship. As a youth, he earned his keep as a talented harpist and singer. Picture, if you will, a gangly, dark-eyed boy in a patched green tunic, his harp slung over his back as he wanders the muddy lanes of medieval London. With an impish grin, he sets up on a street corner and begins to play, his long, agile fingers dancing nimbly over the strings. His clear tenor voice rings out above the clamor of passing carts and barking dogs, weaving tales of heroic knights, fair maidens, and faraway lands. Soon a small crowd gathers around the young bard, entranced by his lyrics and lively melodies. Merchants toss him pennies. Housewives offer him hunks of bread, and children caper merrily to his tunes. For a few enchanted moments, the drudgery of their lives is forgotten, replaced by the magic of Thomas's music. Word of the boy's talent eventually reached the ears of Theobald, the powerful Archbishop of Canterbury. Impressed by Thomas's quick mind and courtly graces, Theobald took the young man under his wing, sending him off to study law and diplomacy at the universities of Paris and Bologna. Here, fate took an unexpected turn. Thomas's wit, intelligence, and charm won him the favor of the new king, Henry II. At just 36, Thomas found himself elevated to the lofty position of Lord Chancellor, becoming the king's chief advisor and right-hand man. The two were inseparable, bonding over a shared love of hunting, drinking, and womanizing. It was said only half-jokingly that they had but one heart and one mind. But the merry bromance was not to last. When the old archbishop died in 1162, Henry appointed Thomas as his successor, assuming the worldly, pliable chancellor would do his bidding. Instead, Thomas underwent a dramatic transformation, casting off his fine silks for a hair shirt and devoting himself wholly to the church. As the new Archbishop of Canterbury, Thomas fiercely defended the rights and privileges of the clergy against the king's attempts to bring them under secular law. The once fast friends became the bitterest of enemies. locked in a titanic struggle for power that would convulse the realm. The feud came to a tragic head in 1170, when an enraged Henry, fuming over Thomas's latest act of defiance, rashly exclaimed, "Will no one rid me of this turbulent priest?" 4 zealous knights, taking the king's words as a command, rode to Canterbury and brutally hacked the archbishop to death on the altar steps of his own cathedral. Christendom was aghast at the murder of an anointed prince of the church. Thomas was swiftly canonized as a martyr, and his shrine at Canterbury became a major pilgrimage site. Immortalized by Chaucer in the Canterbury Tales, the penitent Henry was forced to do public penance, walking barefoot to the tomb and submitting to a symbolic scourging by the monks. And so Thomas Becket, the merchant's son who began his journey as a common entertainer, ended it as a saint and a symbol of the eternal tug-of-war between church and state. It's a breathtaking arc, the stuff of legends, and a testament to the fluidity of medieval society, where a man's wit and determination could propel him to the highest echelons of power. But for every shooting star like Becket, there were hundreds of nameless, forgotten minstrels eking out a precarious living on the roads of Europe. They were the medieval equivalent of starving artists. Their lutes and fiddles in pawn, their next meal dependent on the generosity of strangers. Like modern buskers, they might sing for their supper outside a busy inn or perform tricks in a marketplace, hoping to fill their hat with a few coins. If they were lucky, they might secure a position with a noble household, providing musical accompaniment for feasts and entertainments. But such gigs were not easy to come by. As the 15th century writer Robert Henryson lamented, "The life of a court minstrel is a tough one. To earn your keep, you must forever hold your tongue and play the perfect servant." Those who couldn't catch a patron's eye faced a wearying life of constant travel, their feet blistered from miles of trudging down dusty roads. They were at the mercy of the weather and the fickle whims of audiences. A minstrel who failed to please might find himself pelted with rotten vegetables or worse. Some faced stiff competition from more exotic entertainers like acrobats and animal trainers. A French lord's account books record a payment of 3 gold écus to the man with the dancing bear, 5 écus to the Moor with the juggling ferrets, and a measly half écu to Jacques the balladeer. Poor Jacques upstaged by ferrets. But for all their hardships, these wandering performers played a vital role in medieval society. In a time before mass media, they were the primary purveyors of news, carrying songs and stories from town to town. They helped to spread new ideas and fashions along with the occasional bawdy joke. Their ballads and poems passed down orally from generation to generation are some of our only windows into the thoughts and feelings of ordinary medieval folk. Through their words, we can hear the voices of long-ago lovers, soldiers, rogues, and rebels. All those who history so often forgets. So the next time you pass a busker strumming on a street corner, give a thought to his medieval forebears and maybe toss a coin into his hat. In our own way, we're all minstrels singing for our suppers in this great cosmic tavern. And who knows, you might just be funding the next Thomas Becket. Fair enough. Let us then turn our attention to the fascinating world of medieval festivals and fairs. These boisterous celebrations offered the common folk a much-needed respite from the daily grind, a chance to cut loose and indulge in revelry, if only for a fleeting few days. Imagine, if you will, the excited buzz that would build in a village as the annual fair approached. Traveling merchants and entertainers would begin to trickle in, their wagons laden with exotic wares and mysterious contraptions. The air would fill with the tantalizing aromas of roasting meats and sweet pastries. Brightly colored banners would be unfurled and makeshift stages assembled in the town square. For the villagers, the fair represented a thrilling break from the monotony of their hard-scrabble existence. They could marvel at the strange beasts and human oddities in the menagerie, gasp at the death-defying acrobatics of troops like the lords of misrule, and be transfixed by the bawdy antics of mummers and minstrels. If they were feeling flush with coin, they might try their luck at games of chance or indulge in a rare treat like a sugary dessert or a sip of spiced wine. But beyond the spectacle and indulgence, fairs also played a crucial role in the medieval economy. They were vital centers of trade where merchants could peddle their wares and strike deals with buyers from far-flung regions. The most famous fairs like the St. Bartholomew Fair in England or the Champagne fairs in France would draw traders from across Europe and beyond. For several heady weeks, the hosting town would be transformed into a bustling hub of commerce. Beneath a sea of colorful tents, you would find everything from fine Flemish cloth to Baltic amber, Damascus steel blades to intricate astrolabes. Deals would be hashed out, partnerships forged, and fortunes made and lost on the roll of a dice or the signing of a contract. But perhaps no medieval fair was as renowned for its unabashed merrymaking as the Carnival celebrations hosted by the Dukes of Burgundy in the 15th century. These hedonistic affairs were the stuff of legend. Towering banquet tables groaning under the weight of sumptuous feasts, fountains of wine, and riotous costumed balls that lasted until dawn. At the center of these revels was Philip the Good, the Duke of Burgundy himself. A lover of luxury and spectacle, Philip would spare no expense in putting on the most extravagant festivities in all of Christendom. One infamous banquet in 1454, known as the Feast of the Pheasant, was held to drum up support for a new crusade against the Ottomans. The great hall was decked out like a fantastical pleasure garden with gilded trees, artificial fountains, and an array of marvelous inventions like a mechanical pie filled with live birds. At the climax of the feast, an enormous pastry ship was wheeled out, and a giantess costumed as the Holy Church stepped out to beseech the gathered nobles to pledge themselves to the cause. Swept up in the pageantry and passion of the moment, Duke Philip made a grandiose vow to take up the cross and lead an army to reclaim Constantinople from the infidel. Alas, like so many crusading oaths, it was a promise that would never be fulfilled. Philip, despite his earnest piety, was forever entangled in the intrigues and rivalries of medieval realpolitik. But for that one shining evening, anything seemed possible. Saracens vanquished, the glories of a new Christian empire rising in the east. Such is the magic and power of medieval festivals in the popular imagination both then and now. They offered a tantalizing escape from the often grim realities of life in those times. A chance to dream of brighter tomorrows. Even royalty would partake in the fool's revelry from time to time. During the Feast of Fools held each January, a mock bishop would be elected from among the young clergy, donning ecclesiastical robes and presiding over a topsy-turvy mass filled with bawdy songs and general mischief. For a few anarchic days, the normal social order was gleefully upended. In England, a similar tradition saw a lord of misrule chosen to orchestrate Christmas mayhem in noble households. This merry prankster was given free rein to cause good-natured chaos, leading the servants in rambunctious songs, slapstick skits, and drunken dancing. Even the esteemed King Henry VIII was known to caper and carouse incognito at festivals during his younger years. Perhaps there is something eternally appealing about these temporary flights from the everyday. These socially sanctioned pressure valves. They speak to a fundamental human need to occasionally cast off the shackles of propriety and lose oneself in a bit of carefree merrymaking. From the rambunctious carnivals of medieval Europe to the wild Mardi Gras celebrations of today, we still delight in these festive detours from the daily grind. But alas, all good revels must come to an end. And so too must our whimsical journey through the annals of medieval entertainments draw to a close. As we bid farewell to the jousting knights and carousing jesters, the mischievous mummers and marvelous minstrels, let us tip our hats to the enduring ingenuity of the human spirit. For even in the face of tremendous hardship and strife, our medieval forebears found endlessly inventive ways to enliven their days with fun and folly. May we all strive to bring a bit more of their playful resourcefulness into our modern lives, to fill our days with life-affirming laughter and wonder at every opportunity. And with that gentle reminder, dear viewer, I bid you good night. Sweet dreams of spirited lute strumming and salty tavern tales to you all. You make an excellent point about the importance of fairs to the medieval economy. The great seasonal trade fairs served as vital commercial hubs, attracting merchants and customers from far and wide. These vibrant gatherings were not only crucial for conducting business, but also provided rare opportunities for people to socialize, be entertained, and experience a bustling atmosphere so different from the usual pace of medieval life. One of the largest and most famous of these events was the Stourbridge Fair, held annually near the town of Cambridge, England. Originating way back in the early 1200s as a local gathering for farmers and tradesmen, the fair steadily grew over the centuries in both size and significance. By the late Middle Ages, merchants came from all over England and even from continental Europe to attend the Stourbridge Fair. For nearly a month, from late August to late September, the normally quiet meadows outside Cambridge transformed into a vast tented city alive with commerce and revelry. A Spanish visitor to the fair in the 1400s marveled at the endless rows of stalls selling all manner of goods. Fine textiles, precious spices, handcrafted wares, barrels of wine and ale. It was like the entire world of trade condensed into a single time and place. Just imagine the sights and sounds of this sprawling fair at its peak. Everywhere, merchants and vendors would be calling out their wares, enticing passers-by. Silks and satins, velvets and lace, the finest fabrics from Italy and the East, spices from distant lands, cinnamon, pepper, cloves fit for a king's table, mead as golden as the sun, ale as dark as night, wines to lift the spirit. Mingling with the shouts of sellers was the clamor of countless voices haggling over prices in a dozen languages and accents. the pungent scent of exotic spices mixed with the earthy smells of livestock, hay, and wood smoke from the food stalls. Minstrels and acrobats wove through the throngs, adding flashes of color and music to the bustling scene. The fair was also famous for its many entertainments. Troupes of actors staged mystery plays, religious dramas depicting biblical stories. Puppeteers, jugglers, and acrobats performed to the delight of children and adults alike. And of course, there was the rambunctious temporary district of taverns, alehouses, and gaming dens that catered to the fair's visitors. But the Stourbridge Fair was more than just a giant party. It played a vital economic role. For many merchants and tradesmen, the money they made at this fair could sustain them for the rest of the year. The universities of Oxford and Cambridge relied on the Stourbridge Fair as a major source for the year's supplies, and the tax revenues collected at the fair swelled the king's coffers as well. Unfortunately, like many aspects of medieval life, attending a major fair could also be hazardous. Outbreaks of disease sometimes spread rapidly in the crowded conditions. Fires posed a constant danger in the close-packed temporary stall cities, and the large concentrations of wealth inevitably drew thieves and scammers. To help keep order and settle disputes, a special court known as the Court of Pie Powders was set up at most large fairs. This rather strange name comes from the French pieds poudreux, meaning dusty feet, likely referring to the throngs of fairgoers stirring up the dirt. These temporary courts, based on merchant law, allowed for swift resolution of conflicts that arose during the fair. As the Middle Ages gave way to the early modern era in the 1500s and 1600s, the Stourbridge Fair gradually declined from its former preeminence. The growth of London as England's dominant commercial center, increasing international maritime trade, and the advent of shops open year-round all contributed to its demise. By the 1700s, the once mighty fair had dwindled to a shadow of its former self before vanishing altogether. But for several centuries, the Stourbridge Fair reigned as the indisputable highlight of the medieval English trade calendar. A whirling, sprawling, riotous melange of high commerce and lowbrow amusements, where for a few glorious weeks the usual rules and rhythms of life were suspended. It must have been an incredible spectacle to behold, a grand finale to the fleeting warm days before the onset of another long, lean winter. As we draw near the end of our look at the wild world of medieval pastimes and entertainments, it's fascinating to consider just how important a role these festivities played in the lives of people long ago. From spirited jousts to dizzying trade fairs, they offered not just diversion, but real meaning and much-needed breaks from the unrelenting labor and hardships that most endured. In a time before mass communication and easy travel, events like tournaments and festivals were cherished chances to come together as a community to experience something new and exciting. The pageantry of a joust, the sensory overload of a fair, the bawdy antics of a jester. These joys were all the sweeter for their rarity. Of course, as with many aspects of history, we have to be careful not to over-romanticize the past. For the vast majority of people, leisure time was a luxury and daily survival a constant struggle. Many of the entertainments we've discussed were largely the preserve of the wealthy and privileged, and even the fun could be rough. Injuries and deaths were common at tournaments, and drunken brawls a regular occurrence at fairs. But that makes the resilience and ingenuity of medieval people all the more remarkable. In a world so full of obstacles and adversity, they still found ways to come together and celebrate, to infuse their difficult lives with color and excitement. Just like people in every place and period of history, they showed that indomitable human urge to make meaning and seek joy even in the unlikeliest of circumstances. So, while it's easy to dismiss the Middle Ages as a backward, barbaric time, the truth is always more complex. The more we learn about the beliefs, struggles, and daily experiences of medieval people, the more we may recognize some of our own hopes and fears reflected back at us. At the end of the day, across the vast gulf of centuries, they were not so different from us. Just humans doing their best with the lot they were given, finding what joy and meaning they could along the way. And if our modern world, with all its wonders and conveniences, should ever feel too frenetic or frayed, perhaps we could learn a thing or two from our medieval ancestors about the simple pleasures of a bawdy story well told, or a lively tune played on a humble lute under an open sky. But for now, the sights and sounds of our imaginary Stourbridge Fair begin to gently recede as weariness draws its soft cloak about us. The bright banners and tents fade into twilight shadows. The shouts and laughter of the fairgoers muffled to a distant murmur. Rest now, weary time traveler, and may your dreams be filled with the vivid colors and merry melodies of a world long past, but never truly lost. Good night. The nobility also enjoyed lavish feasts and banquets, which were a chance to showcase their wealth, power, and sophisticated tastes. The great halls of castles and manors would be decked out with embroidered tapestries, gleaming candelabras, and long tables covered in white linen. The guests, dressed in their finest attire, would be seated according to their rank with the host and most important personages at the high table. The kitchens would be a hive of activity with dozens of cooks, scullions, and servers preparing a dizzying array of dishes. A typical feast might start with a first course of soups, stews, and savory tarts, followed by a main course of roasted meats like venison, wild boar, swan, and peacock, often presented in elaborate displays with their feathers reattached. Alongside the meats, there would be a variety of side dishes, including freshwater fish, eels, lobster, oysters, salads, and a plethora of vegetables like peas, asparagus, and artichokes. The finest delicacies were flavored with exotic and expensive spices like saffron, ginger, cloves, and nutmeg, which were imported from distant lands at great cost. Diners would eat off of trenchers, which were flat rounds of stale bread that served as an edible plate. They would use their personal knife to spear food from the common serving dishes, and their fingers to convey it to their mouth. Forks were not in common use yet. Between courses, the trenchers would be given as alms to the poor. Wine, ale, and mead flowed freely from ornate goblets and drinking horns. A royal feast could feature up to 7 courses and last for many hours, often with musicians, jesters, and other entertainments between the courses. It was considered the height of refinement and courtesy for a lord to offer a particularly choice morsel of food to an honored guest with his own knife. One of the most lavish and legendary feasts of the medieval period was the Feast of the Pheasant, hosted by Philip the Good, Duke of Burgundy in 1454. The occasion was Philip's declaration of his intent to go on a crusade against the Ottomans who had recently captured Constantinople. The banquet featured a series of elaborate entremets or sculpted foods that served as table decorations and conveyed allegorical messages. There was a large pudding in the shape of a castle with the banners of the Ottoman Sultan, which Philip dramatically sliced into. There was a giant pie from which burst 28 musicians dressed as birds when it was cut open. The table also featured a statue of a naked woman crying tears of rosewater in supplication for the defense of Constantinople. Each course was served to the accompaniment of pageants, songs, and dramatic readings, celebrating the chivalric valor of going on crusade. At the high point of the feast, a live pheasant was brought in, elaborately decorated with a gold collar and jewels. Philip and his fellow lords made solemn vows on the pheasant to fight the infidel. Ironically, despite all the pomp and ceremony, Philip never actually went on crusade as he was too preoccupied with enlarging his own territories. The Feast of the Pheasant exemplified the late medieval style of courtly opulence and pageantry. Such occasions were designed to dazzle the senses and showcase the wealth and power of the nobility. They were also highly symbolic, with each decorative element and figure conveying a story or moral lesson. The birds bursting out of pies represented the souls being freed from the torments of purgatory. The woman weeping rosewater tears embodied the anguish of Christian suffering under Ottoman rule. Despite their extravagance, medieval banquets could also be quite unhygienic affairs by modern standards. The rush floors of the great halls were often littered with bones, spilled food and drink, and even dog droppings from the lord's hunting hounds lounging under the tables. The elaborate displays of dressed-up animals like peacocks with all their plumage would be left out for hours, becoming a breeding ground for bacteria. And the communal washing of hands in shared basins of water before and after the meal did little to prevent the spread of disease. Amidst all the excess and grandeur of noble feasts, one quiet revolutionary was laying the foundations of modern French cuisine. Guillaume Tirel, better known as Taillevent, served as master chef to no less than 3 French kings: Philip VI, Charles V, and Charles VI, between 1326 to 1395. Taillevent's reputation was such that he was placed in charge of organizing the coronation feast of Charles V in 1364, which featured a staggering array of 66 dishes divided into 3 courses. Taillevent is most famous for writing one of the earliest medieval cookbooks called Le Viandier, which contained 230 recipes ranging from simple dishes like omelets and vegetable soups to complex preparations of venison, boar, and other game meats. Taillevent emphasized the importance of fresh ingredients, careful seasoning, and attractive presentation. He also began to codify the elaborate rituals and protocols of formal dining, such as the progression of courses, the pairing of dishes with sauces, and the art of carving meats. Some of Taillevent's recipes seem strange and unappealing to modern tastes, such as the garbage, which was a stew made from the entrails and offal of various animals. Another dish was mominy, which was a sweet and savory porridge of wheat, almonds, rice, cinnamon, saffron, and sugar, often dyed a vivid green color with parsley juice. The most infamous was cockentrice, a Frankenstein-esque creation made by stitching together the upper half of a capon with the bottom half of a piglet and coating it in egg yolk and saffron before roasting. However, many of Taillevent's other recipes and techniques were well ahead of their time and laid the groundwork for the development of haute cuisine. He was one of the first chefs to recommend using butter and heavy cream to enrich and thicken sauces. He developed a precursor to the roux, the foundational mixture of butter and flour used to make sauces like béchamel and velouté. Taillevent's blancmange, an almond-flavored chicken stew thickened with rice flour, anticipated the more refined blancmanges of the 17th and 18th centuries made with milk and sugar. He pioneered new pâtés, terrines, and the use of the pastry crust as a decorative container for savory fillings like meat and cheese. In a sense, Taillevent was one of the world's first celebrity chefs, renowned for his artistry and skill, and setting the standard for generations of cooks to come after him. Even outside of royal courts and noble manors, the rising middle class of medieval towns and cities enjoyed good food and conviviality at taverns and inns. A typical tavern meal might include a savory pottage or stew, bread, pickled vegetables, and simple roasted meats or fish, all washed down with plenty of ale or cider. Taverns were also social hubs where people would gather to exchange news, sing songs, and play various games. Dice games were especially popular, including early versions of craps and hazard. Other common games included nine men's Morris, fox, and geese, tables, an early form of backgammon, and chess. Chess was considered the most intellectually challenging and prestigious of the medieval games, the so-called Game of Kings. It was a favorite pastime of nobles, scholars, and clergy who would often engage in matches for high-stakes wagers. The Lewis chessmen are perhaps the most famous surviving medieval chess pieces discovered on the Isle of Lewis off the coast of Scotland in 1831. The hoard contained 93 game pieces in total, including kings, queens, bishops, knights, and pawns intricately carved from walrus ivory and whale's teeth in the elaborate Romanesque style of the 12th century. Most of the pieces are housed in the British Museum, with a few held at the National Museum of Scotland. The Lewis chessmen capture the vibrant and imaginative spirit of medieval craftsmen. The kings sit slouched on their thrones, wearing dour expressions and holding their swords across their laps. The knights are mounted on small ponies, their eyes bulging with fierce concentration. The rooks or warders are depicted as wild-eyed berserker warriors biting the tops of their shields in battle frenzy. Scholars believe the chessmen were likely crafted in Trondheim, Norway between 1150 to 1200 AD. At that time, the Isle of Lewis was part of the Kingdom of Norway, and the presence of such a rich hoard suggests it may have belonged to a high-ranking noble who was traveling through the area. Archaeologists speculate that the chessmen may have been concealed during a shipwreck or buried by a merchant en route to trading markets in Ireland. The Lewis chessmen are not only exquisite works of art, but also a window into the popular pastimes and material culture of the medieval nobility. Chess was more than just a frivolous game. It was seen as a way to sharpen strategic thinking, hone courtly graces, and display cultured tastes. Possessing an ornate set of chessmen carved from expensive materials like ivory was a mark of social status and prestige. One of the most chess-obsessed medieval monarchs was King Alfonso X of Castile, also known as Alfonso the Wise. Alfonso was a renowned scholar and patron of the arts who wrote extensively on a wide range of topics including science, law, history, and music. In 1283, he commissioned the production of a lavishly illustrated manuscript called the Book of Games, or Libro de los Juegos in Spanish. The Book of Games is one of the most important sources we have on medieval games and their rules. It contains 97 pages of detailed descriptions and color illustrations of various games, primarily chess, dice, and tables. The chess problems in particular are highly advanced and complex, attesting to Alfonso's skill and passion for the game. Interestingly, the book also includes astrological charts linking certain dice rolls to the influence of the planets and the zodiac. This reflects the medieval belief in the interconnectedness of all aspects of the cosmos, and how even seemingly random games of chance could be imbued with deeper symbolic meaning. Alfonso was not alone in his love of gambling. Many medieval nobles were notorious for their high-stakes wagers on games of dice, cards, and chess. In 1254, King Louis IX of France had to ban gambling on the Crusades because too many of his soldiers were losing their money in arms. In England, King Henry VIII was known to lose vast sums at dice and cards, contributing to the depletion of the royal treasury. Perhaps the most extravagant expression of the medieval passion for gambling was the ridotto, or private gambling house established in Venice in 1638. The ridotto was essentially an early casino featuring various rooms and tables for playing games like basetta, biribi, and dice. It catered to the wealthy nobility and was famous for its opulent decor with gilded mirrors, plush carpets, and frescoed ceilings. The ridotto set the stage for the development of casinos and gambling resorts in the modern era. But it also reflects the timeless human fascination with games of chance and skill, the thrill of risk and reward, and the desire to test one's luck and prowess against others. From the humblest tavern dice games to the game of kings played with ornate ivory chessmen, medieval pastimes reveal the ingenuity and playfulness of the human spirit across the ages. Of course, no medieval nobleman's prestige was complete without a love of hunting, the true sport of kings. Hunting was not just a recreational pastime, but also an important symbolic ritual that affirmed rank, martial prowess, and dominion over nature. Great lords maintained vast hunting parks called forests, chases, or warrens, where they alone had the right to hunt game like deer, boar, and hare. These parks were patrolled by gamekeepers and foresters who prevented poaching by commoners on pain of severe punishment. A nobleman's hunting retinue was a microcosm of the medieval social order. At the top was the lord himself, often on horseback, armed with a sword, lance, or bow. Then came his huntsmen, prickers, and yeomen, each with their specialized roles and distinctive livery. The huntsmen, also called burners, handled the hounds, the big, powerful raches and allants used to chase and bring down the quarry. Prickers were mounted hunters who rode ahead to flush out game with horns and cries of, "High Talbot, high a Beaumont." Lower in status were the unmounted yeomen armed with boar spears and quarterstaffs, and the beaters who drove prey out of the underbrush with staves and rattles. At the bottom were the humble trencher hounds who served as food tasters and disposers of offal and carrion. Strict codes and rituals governed every noble hunt. The type of game hunted, the weapons used, and even the cuts of meat one was entitled to all depended on one's place in the feudal hierarchy. A lord was expected to know the proper terminology for every aspect of the hunt, from the fumettes or droppings of the heart to the curé, the elaborate butchering and feeding of the carcass to the hounds. Few lords were more passionate about hunting than Philip the Bold, Duke of Burgundy. Philip was a larger-than-life figure who embodied the pageantry and excess of the Burgundian court in the 14th century. He inherited one of the largest and richest duchies in Europe, encompassing not just Burgundy, but also Flanders, Brabant, and Holland. Philip used his vast wealth to indulge his love of fine art, music, tournaments, and above all, the thrill of the chase. Philip's court was renowned for its opulence and spectacle, with lavish banquets, masques, and entertainments. But it was his hunting expeditions that truly showcased his power and prestige. The Duke's hunting retinue could number over 1,000 men with hundreds of hounds, horses, and hawks. They would set out in a vast, colorful procession with trumpets blaring and banners snapping in the wind, led by Philip himself in resplendent hunting attire. One of Philip's favorite hunting grounds was the forest of Crécy near his castle of Hesdin in Picardy. There in 1387, Philip hosted a legendary hunting party for his brother King Charles VI of France and his uncles the Dukes of Berry and Bourbon. The forest was stocked with a staggering array of game, including deer, boar, wolves, foxes, hares, and birds. The hunters rode out at dawn, divided into 4 parties, each led by one of the royal dukes. Philip, as the host, had the privilege of leading the first chase. According to the chronicler Jean Froissart, the Duke's hounds quickly flushed out a hart of 10, a magnificent stag which led them on a wild chase through the forest. The hart finally sought refuge in a small pond where it was surrounded by the baying hounds. But rather than let the hounds make the kill, Philip dismounted and approached the stag on foot, lance in hand. In a show of martial valor, he dispatched the hart with a single thrust of his spear to the cheers of his fellow hunters. The bloody carcass was then carried back to the castle in a triumphal procession to be butchered and served at the evening banquet in Philip's great hall. This ritual of personally killing the stag was deeply significant in medieval hunting culture. It was a symbolic reenactment of the mythical chase of the white stag, an elusive, almost supernatural creature that led the hunter into the enchanted realm of the forest. Slaying the stag was seen as a test of courage, skill, and virility, a way for a lord to prove his worth as a warrior and a man. For Philip, the art of hunting was inseparable from the art of war. He was a fierce and canny military commander who fought in some of the most important battles of the 100 Years' War between England and France. In 1382, Philip led the French army to a decisive victory over the rebellious weavers and artisans of Flanders at the Battle of Rosebecque. He was also a key player in the complex web of negotiations, marriages, and treaties that shaped the political landscape of late medieval Europe. But perhaps Philip's greatest legacy was his role in transforming Burgundy into a cultural and artistic powerhouse that rivaled the great city-states of Italy. He patronized some of the most celebrated Flemish artists of the day, including the sculptor Klaus Sluter and the painter Melchior Bruderlam. The illuminated manuscripts, tapestries, and goldsmiths' work commissioned by Philip's court set a new standard of virtuosity and sophistication. This opulence reached its apex in Philip's grandson, Philip the Good, and his legendary Feast of the Pheasant, which we described earlier. But Philip the Bold set the stage for Burgundy's cultural ascendancy through his savvy blend of martial prowess, political cunning, and artistic patronage. The rituals of the hunt were an essential part of this package, projecting an image of noble power and prestige that dazzled contemporaries and echoed through the ages. Of course, hunting was not just the preserve of great dukes and kings. Let's continue our foray into the wild world of medieval leisure and pleasure. But before we get too carried away, I must caution that the nobility tended to have all the fun, while life was no carnival for the toiling peasants. You see, 90% of the population were serfs, virtual slaves bound to the land, breaking their backs to grow food for the other 10%, those lucky, plucky nobles. Even so, the commoners found time between back-breaking labor for a few simple amusements of their own. I suppose you could say they were experts at making their own fun. Imagine yourself a humble medieval peasant. If you weren't busy tilling the fields, slopping the hogs, or darning your only ragged tunic, you might steal a few precious moments to play Nine Men's Morris, a deceptively simple yet absorbing board game played with pebbles and sticks. No fancy-dancy PlayStation 5 required, just a slab of wood and a pocket full of rocks. Chess was another favorite, and archaeological evidence shows it crossed all social classes. From haughty lords to lowly serfs, everyone loved a good game of chess. But the most magnificent chess set of the Middle Ages has to be the Lewis chessman. Discovered by a farmer on the remote Isle of Lewis off the coast of Scotland in 1831. Carved from walrus ivory and whale teeth in the 12th century, these expressive little kings, queens, bishops, and knights are a marvel to behold. Just who owned this exquisite set remains a tantalizing mystery lost to time. Some speculate a merchant was carrying them to a lucrative sale when his ship foundered near Lewis. Imagine the look on his face as his precious cargo plummeted to the bottom of the sea. But they were not doomed to a watery grave forever. Only about 700 years or so before being miraculously resurrected. But I digress. So back to our poor beleaguered peasants. They couldn't afford walrus tusk chessmen. But that didn't stop them from having a jolly good time rolling the dice. In fact, gambling was a favorite pastime of all classes. So much so that one irate 13th century preacher railed against the damnable art of dice play, fearing it would corrupt the youth into sloth and depravity. But no matter how the preacher prattled on, dicing was devilishly popular. Chaucer's Canterbury Tales are chock full of gambling references. Those merry pilgrims just couldn't wait to get to the next inn to try their luck at hazard or put their pennies on a pair of sixes. Even kings and bishops would lay a wager or two on the toss of the knucklebones, the forerunner of dice made from actual animal knuckles. But gambling wasn't just a harmless hobby. It could be downright dangerous in the Middle Ages. In 1190, the King of France and the King of England got into a row over a particularly heated dice game and nearly came to blows. Talk about royal temper tantrums. One can only imagine the poor quaking page who had to break up that spat. But it seems the French never learned their lesson. A few centuries later, King Henry IV of France once lost an entire district of Paris in a single roll of the dice. Now that's what I call high-stakes gambling. Indeed, such wagers could have far-reaching consequences. According to medieval chroniclers, the region of Mortagne in Normandy got its name from a very unlucky throw of the dice. The story goes that William of Normandy lost the county to his brother Robert during a game and exclaimed in French, "Mal ten," meaning badly held. Whether a tall tale or true story, it certainly proves that when it came to dicing, The stakes didn't get much higher than a chunk of the duchy. But for those wishing to avoid flashing daggers over the hazard table, a friendly game of tables was just the ticket. An ancestor of our modern backgammon, this ancient game was hugely popular across medieval Europe from London to Constantinople. The Book of Games, commissioned by King Alfonso X of Castile, depicts bejeweled nobles and turbaned Moors hunched in studious concentration over their boards. One can almost hear the satisfying rattle of the dice and click-clack of the pieces. Curiously, many surviving sets have a lopsided number of counters, perhaps to give a skilled player a winning edge over a well-heeled but half-witted opponent. But you may be wondering, with all this talk of gambling, where did medieval folk go to get their game on? Why, the local tavern, of course. These dingy, smoky dens served up hearty helpings of ale, gossip, and gaming galore. Forget the jousts and tournaments. This is where the real action happened. Imagine a cramped, dimly lit room packed with boisterous patrons. A virtual rogues gallery of cut purses, sailors, apprentices, and wayward clerics, their faces flickering in the light of guttering tallow candles. In one corner, a grizzled man-at-arms rolls his remaining dice with a trembling hand, the last of his wages riding on this final toss. In another, a group of rascally students cluster over a game of fox and geese, their whoops of triumph and howls of despair punctuating the merry din. The harried tavern keeper scurries to and fro with foaming flagons of ale, pausing only to cuff the ears of a stable boy filching hazelnuts from a bowl. Yes, it's a far cry from the glittering castle banquet hall, but you can't beat it for a good night out. But man cannot subsist on dice alone, so all this gaming would work up a mighty hunger and powerful thirst. No worries, though, for the average tavern offered a lip-smacking array of hearty fare to keep those gamblers going. A typical spread might include crusty manchet bread, zesty cheese, and perhaps a leek pottage, all washed down with quarts of strong brown ale. And if you were feeling particularly flush, you might splash out on a roasted capon or savory meat pie. Just be sure to keep one eye on your trencher and the other on your purse, lest some light-fingered rogue make off with your supper or your steaks. But I fear I may have painted too sordid a picture of the medieval tavern. To be sure, many were upstanding establishments frequented by honest working folk just looking to unwind after a hard day's toil. Why, even the most respectable craftsmen would gather to hoist a pint, swap tales, and yes, enjoy a friendly game or three. The tanner might try his hand against the cooper, the girdler against the glover, their good-natured ribbing and occasional oaths echoing into the wee hours. But gaming wasn't the only entertainment on offer at your local medieval watering hole. If you were lucky, a wandering minstrel might drop by to ply his trade, brightening up the evening with sprightly tunes and stirring tales of heroic deeds. A skilled recounting of Gawain and the Green Knight could make you forget the flea bites and watered-down wine for a little while anyway. Other nights you might be treated to the antics of a jester or a troupe of tumblers, their daring acrobatics and ribald japs coaxing chuckles and cheers from even the most dour-faced patrons. Of course, such diversions were not without risk. One false move and an ambitious acrobat could wind up face first in a patron's pottage. I imagine more than one vacationing pope or lofty lord found himself wearing his soup after a juggling feat gone awry. But no form of medieval tavern entertainment could top the spectacle of the dancing bear. That's right. For a few coins, you could watch a shaggy, hulking beast lumber and sway to the mournful strains of a hurdy-gurdy. Just how the bear felt about his part in the act remains a historical mystery, but one suspects even the promise of a sticky bun or two failed to erase the indignity of it all. Indeed, animal welfare was not exactly top priority in the Middle Ages. But tavern bears were downright domesticated compared to the ferocious creatures stalked by noble hunters in the wild woods beyond the castle walls. Oh yes, hunting was the sport of kings and princes long before polo ponies and cricket bats. And any self-respecting medieval monarch worth his salt kept a well-stocked hunting lodge or two. Imagine yourself a guest at one of these rustic yet luxurious retreats. After a night spent on goose-down mattresses and Flemish-laced sheets, you rise at dawn to join the royal hunting party. Outside, dozens of keen-nosed hounds strain at their leashes, their barks and bays shattering the misty morning calm. Liveried pages scurry to and fro, bearing gleaming hunting horns and tooled leather saddles. And what a resplendent sight are the nobles themselves in their fur-trimmed cloaks and rich velvet gowns. But don't be fooled by all the pomp and pageantry. This is no pony ride in the park. A medieval hunt was a hardcore, often dangerous affair. You see, the nobles weren't tracking bunnies and badgers. Oh no, they were going after savage wild boar, fierce bears, and swift, deadly stags. Those picturesque tapestries of dainty lords and ladies prancing after a fluffy snow-white unicorn? Pure poppycock propaganda spun by wily craftsmen looking to line their pockets with ducats from doe-eyed damsels. No. If you really wanted to impress your noble buddies, you set your sights on big game. The bigger and meaner, the better. Why, even kings and popes got in on the action. In 1461, King Louis XVIII of France threw down the gauntlet to the Duke of Burgundy, challenging his rival to a boar-laying contest. Now that's what I call a royal rumble. Eat your heart out, WrestleMania. But it wasn't just two-legged prey that medieval hunters had to watch out for. Many an overconfident young noble found himself gored by a raging boar or mauled by a grumpy bear. In 1477, the Duchess Mary of Burgundy, flushed with the thrill of the chase, took a nasty tumble from her horse and broke her back. She died 2 short days later at the tender age of 25. I suppose you could say curiosity killed the Duchess. Now, I bet you're thinking hunting was just another macho pastime for manly, meat-loving men. Well, think again. Some of the most celebrated hunters of the Middle Ages were women. Take Queen Elizabeth of York, for example. This 15th century huntress was renowned for her skill with a crossbow and could shoot a stag through the eye at 200 paces. Now that's what I call a dead eye. But no medieval huntress could top the exploits of Margaret of Anjou, the fearsome 15th century Queen of England. This indomitable lady was an avid hunter and formidable warrior, personally leading her troops into battle during the Wars of the Roses. It was said she could track a hart through a moonless night and once took down a charging boar with a single thrust of her spear. Forget Queen of Hearts. This was the Queen of Hunting. Of course, Not everyone had the stomach for such blood-pumping exploits. For those who preferred their thrills without the spills, there was always the muse. No, I'm not talking about the sound a kitten makes, but rather the medieval version of a falconry center. Here, noble lords and ladies could experience the rush of the hunt from the comfort of a shady garden or castle terrace. Imagine whiling away a lazy afternoon, watching your favorite goshawk or peregrine falcon wheel and soar through the cloudless sky, then plummet like a thunderbolt upon some hapless hare or quail. Falconry was the Ferrari of the Middle Ages, flashy, expensive, and oh so thrilling. But like a high-performance sports car, a falconry bird required constant care and attention. A large royal mews might employ dozens of falconers, each tasked with training and tending to a particular bird. It was a delicate art requiring patience, skill, and nerves of steel. After all, one false move, and you could find yourself at the business end of a razor-sharp beak or set of talons. But for those who could afford it, falconry was the ultimate status symbol. Why, a prized gerfalcon from Greenland or Iceland could set you back the equivalent of a small castle. But it was money well spent. For a noble with a falcon perched on his fist was sure to turn heads at court. Why even Shakespeare name-dropped the sport in his plays. A sure sign it was the talk of the town. But as with so many medieval pastimes, falconry was not without its risks. In 1500, King Louis XIII of France was out hawking with his courtiers when his prized bird was attacked by a pair of eagles. In the ensuing aerial dogfight, the king was accidentally struck by a stray talon and blinded in one eye. Now that's what I call a royal hunting accident. But I fear I may have given you the impression that medieval falconry was all pomp and pageantry. In truth, it served a vital role in putting food on the royal table. You see, falcons were the guided missiles of the Middle Ages, capable of taking down fast-flying game birds like ducks and partridges that were difficult to catch with traditional hunting methods. Why, a skilled falcon could snatch a plump goose right out of the sky. A welcome addition to any medieval feast. Ah, but we mustn't forget the real stars of the show, the birds themselves. From the majestic gerfalcon to the nimble merlin, these feathered hunters were the pride and joy of any medieval muse. But perhaps none was more prized than the peregrine falcon, a sleek, swift predator that could reach speeds of over 200 mph in a high-speed dive known as a stoop. Watching one of these magnificent birds plummet from the heavens to strike its quarry was a sight that would make even the most jaded noble's heart skip a beat. But as much as the nobles loved their falcons, they weren't above a little friendly competition. Falconry contests were a popular pastime, with nobles vying to see whose bird could take the most game or perform the most dazzling aerial maneuvers. Why? In 1390, King Richard II of England organized a grand falconry tournament to celebrate his marriage to Anne of Bohemia. Lords and ladies from across the realm flocked to the event, each hoping to win the coveted prize. A solid gold falcon hood encrusted with precious gems. But while falconry was a sport fit for a king, it wasn't the only winged wonder to capture the medieval imagination. No, for some, nothing could beat the majestic sight of a mighty swan gliding across a glassy moat. But don't let their serene beauty fool you. In the Middle Ages, swans were serious business. You see, all swans were property of the crown, and woe betide any peasant caught poaching one for their pot. Why? In 1482, a hapless farmer was hanged for killing a swan that had been eating his crops. I suppose you could say it was a case of duck, goose, swan. But not all medieval bird lovers were so bloodthirsty. In fact, some preferred to keep their feathered friends closer to home. Songbirds like nightingales, linnets, and goldfinches were popular pets among the nobility, prized for their sweet voices and colorful plumage. Why, even nuns and monks got in on the action, keeping finches and canaries to brighten up their cloisters with a little bird song. But perhaps the most famous medieval bird lover of all was Saint Francis of Assisi. This gentle Italian friar was renowned for his love of all God's creatures, great and small. Legend has it that he once preached a sermon to a flock of attentive birds, exhorting them to praise their Creator with their songs. Now that's what I call a bird-brained idea. But I digress. You're probably wondering what all this talk of hawks and swans has to do with medieval entertainment. Well, you see, falconry and bird keeping were just two of the many ways that medieval folk found beauty and wonder in the natural world. In a time before zoos and wildlife documentaries, the creatures of forest and field held a special fascination for people of all classes. Why, even the humble hedgehog had its moment in the medieval sun. Yes, you heard me right. The hedgehog. In the Middle Ages, these spiky little insectivores were believed to have all sorts of magical powers. Some folk kept them as pets, believing they could ward off evil spirits and cure everything from baldness to bubonic plague. Others used their quills to make charms and amulets, or even ground them up into potions and powders. But perhaps the most bizarre hedgehog-related pastime was the sport of urchin rolling. Competitors would roll a live hedgehog down a hill and place bets on how far it would go before unrolling itself. Now that's what I call a prickly situation. I can only imagine the hedgehog's relief when it finally came to a stop, quills quivering with indignation. But lest you think the Middle Ages were all fun and games, let us not forget the grim realities of life. Through games of chance and skill, medieval people of all walks of life found ways to test their luck and stave off boredom. From the lowliest taverns to the halls of grand castles, the clatter of dice and chess pieces provided a lively soundtrack to medieval life. Perhaps the most famous gaming relics to survive from the Middle Ages are the Lewis chessmen. This intricately carved set of walrus ivory chess pieces was discovered on the Isle of Lewis off the coast of Scotland in 1831. 93 pieces from 4 distinct sets were found. Although who they belonged to remains a captivating mystery lost to time. The Lewis chessmen are believed to have been made in Trondheim, Norway in the 12th century, based on their ornate Romanesque style. The kings, queens, bishops, knights, and warders are depicted as solemn figures sitting with swords across their laps or grasping their faces deep in thought. One can imagine a wealthy Norwegian noble commissioning the set only to have them go missing on a voyage across the sea. The superstitious crew perhaps casting the idolatrous chessmen overboard in the smoky den of a medieval tavern. Chess was just one of many games of strategy that mingled with rambunctious dice games and rounds of backgammon or tables. Archaeologists have uncovered boards scratched into the tops of barrels and benches, a sign of just how ubiquitous such pastimes were. The medieval version of nine men's Morris, played with pegs or stones on a board or dirt grid, was so popular that countless boards survived scratched into cloister seats and even the porches of cathedrals. But for sheer variety, few could match the gaming habits of King Alfonso X of Castile. The learned king, also known as Alfonso the Wise, commissioned an impressive tome called the Libro de los Juegos, or Book of Games, in 1283. The book depicts the rules of chess, dice, and tables, accompanied by lavish illustrations of players engaged in the games. One memorable anecdote tells of a tense chess game between King Henry III of England and Louis VI of France in 1119. The two monarchs sat hunched over the board, each determined to outmaneuver the other. But when Louis triumphed, Henry, in a fit of kingly rage, flung the chessboard at Louis's head, drawing blood. A century later, chess again sparked an international incident when Richard the Lionheart and Philip Augustus of France got into a scuffle over a wager on a game. Clearly, medieval notions of being a good sport had their limits. For those craving the atmosphere of a casino, one needed only to visit medieval Venice. It was there that the Gluck house or ridotto first emerged in the 13th century. These little houses of luck were early gambling halls where dice games and card games were played for high stakes. Situated in private wings of palazzos, the well-heeled patrons of the ridotto lounged on Turkish carpets, played games like tarot and primero, and enjoyed sweetmeats and chilled wine between turns. But of course, man cannot live on gaming alone. The medieval nobility had more refined tastes when it came to leisure, and nothing was more synonymous with their privileged status than the thrill of the hunt. Hunting was far more than a mere pastime for the nobility. It was an all-encompassing way of life, one deeply entwined with prestige, pageantry, and power. Few exemplified the medieval aristocratic love of the hunt more than Mary of Burgundy. The Duchess of Burgundy, Mary was one of the wealthiest women in Europe, renowned for her patronage of the arts. But above all, Mary adored hunting and falconry. As an expert rider and hawk trainer, she thought nothing of spending long days in the saddle pursuing quarry. Tragically, Mary's life was cut short at the age of 25, when she insisted on riding out to hunt just weeks after a difficult childbirth. Galloping through the forest, her horse tripped, and Mary was thrown against a tree, breaking her back. She languished in agony for days before finally succumbing to her injuries. The whole of Burgundy mourned their vivacious, sports-loving duchess. A medieval noble hunt was a grand affair, a portable festival that unfolded across the landscape. A sea of colorful silk tents and pavilions would spring up in forest clearings, with portable tapestries and furnishings transforming the rustic camps into something fit for aristocratic tastes. The chief huntsman or master of game oversaw a small army of foresters, dog handlers, and beaters who worked to drive deer and boar within range of the noble hunters. The protocol of the hunt was deeply serious to the medieval nobility, with an elaborate system of rituals governing every aspect. Special hunting horns sounded unique calls for different prey or parts of the chase. At the end of a successful hunt, the hunters and hounds were honored in a solemn ceremony. The deer's entrails and organs were spread out on its hide in a precise arrangement and offered to the dogs as a reward. But the spectacle of the noble hunt paled in comparison to the sheer exoticism and novelty of traveling entertainers. In a time long before Netflix, these roving troops of musicians, poets, acrobats, and jugglers brought much-needed diversion to the farthest-flung corners of medieval Europe. Perhaps the most storied example of a performer turned power broker is Thomas Becket. Before becoming a man of the cloth, Becket served as a minstrel in the court of Theobald of Bec, the Archbishop of Canterbury in the 12th century. There, Becket's quick wit and lyrical talents caught the attention of King Henry II, who appointed him Lord Chancellor in 1155. Becket and Henry became inseparable friends, partners in youthful revels and shenanigans. But their relationship soured when Becket was appointed Archbishop of Canterbury and took his spiritual duties far more seriously than Henry had anticipated. The rift culminated in 1170, when in a fit of rage, Henry allegedly cried, "Who will rid me of this turbulent priest?" 4 of Henry's knights took this as a royal command. They rode to Canterbury Cathedral, where they confronted Becket, drew their swords, and brutally murdered him on the altar steps. Becket's shocking martyrdom reverberated throughout Christendom. Miracles were reported at his tomb, and Canterbury became a major pilgrimage site, forever linked to Becket's memory. Of course, few minstrels could dream of rising to such lofty heights or suffering such a dramatic demise. For most, a life on the road was one of hardship and uncertainty, forever chasing the next meal or a dry place to lay one's head. They were the medieval equivalent of starving artists. A group of 12th century French troubadours found their meal ticket by carrying the new art form of courtly love poetry from castle to castle, singing fervent odes comparing their noble patronesses to goddesses. Poets like Chrétien de Troyes gained fame and royal favor. It was de Troyes who composed the first tales of Lancelot, Perceval, and the Holy Grail that would capture imaginations for centuries to come. But perhaps no medieval entertainer was so synonymous with providing a good time as the humble court jester. Forever clad in motley, these impudent funnymen cartwheeled across castle halls and banquet tables, regaling lords and ladies with ribald jokes, clever puns, and acrobatic feats. A famous jester named Roland Lepetit was known for his ability to jump up onto his liege's table, steal a quick swig of wine, and backflip off without disturbing a single dish. Such antics provided a welcome steam valve, allowing sly criticism of the social order under the guise of foolery. In a world where a stray word could mean a trip to the gallows, the jester's role as a sanctioned speaker of truth to power was vital. But a few special times a year, the social order itself turned upside down. Medieval people eagerly looked forward to festival days as a respite from ceaseless toil. And no celebration threw open the doors to misrule and mayhem quite like Carnival. With roots in Roman winter revelries, Carnival flourished in medieval Europe as a final burst of excess before the privations of Lent. This farewell to flesh reached its most riotous heights in 15th century Burgundy under the Dukes Philip the Good and Charles the Bold. For days, the streets of Bruges and Ghent became one continuous party with lavish parades, bonfires, and open-air feasts. Elaborate costumes allowed revelers to shed their everyday identities and indulge their wilder natures. Role reversals were common, with the poor dressing as priests or nobles and vice versa. A lord of misrule was often elected to serve as a mock ruler who gleefully parodied the decrees of church and state. Such egalitarian antics foreshadowed the Feast of Fools held each December when a lowly boy bishop ruled over even the highest church officials. This carnival spirit of social inversion provided a safety valve, however brief, from the rigid medieval hierarchy. But Carnival was not the only time when medieval people let loose. Trade fairs vital to the medieval economy doubled as rambunctious festivals, complete with sideshows and entertainments sprawling across town squares or open fields. Fairs like England's St. Bartholomew Fair became known as a Bartholomew baby for the sheer number of unplanned pregnancies that followed each year. For a few precious days, peasants and nobles alike browsed stalls piled high with Flemish woolens, Venetian glassware, and exotic spices. They gaped at performing animals and hired freak shows. They guffawed at bawdy farces and mystery plays performed by amateur troupes. For a few silver pennies, the so-called Bartholomew birds could purchase mead and grilled pork pies, perhaps served by a comely tavern girl with a risque reputation. Such revelry no doubt provided a welcome escape from the drudgery and danger of medieval life. In an age when few could expect to see their 40th birthday, the promise of a few days of wine, laughter, and forgetting at the fair made the back-breaking labor in between seem almost worthwhile. And so, as our tryst with the wild and woolly world of medieval merriment draws to a close, one can't help but ponder what future generations might think of our own pastimes. Will scholars a millennium hence marvel at our football and pumpkin spice latte rituals? Puzzle over the allure of binge-watching prestige television? One thing is certain. The human need for diversion is as old as civilization itself. However technologies and fashions might shift, we remain a species deeply driven to amuse ourselves by any means necessary. So, as you drift off, soothed by these medieval revels recounted, this humble narrator wishes you a restful slumber filled with visions of gallant knights and puckish jesters. If these tales of olden days brought a smile to your sleepy face, do consider hoisting a flag in my honor with a like or subscribe. It would be most heartily appreciated, my lords and ladies. And so to sleep. Her chance to dream of a time when iPhones were the stuff of sorcery and the biggest influencer in the land was the Pope. Those were the days, my friend. We thought they'd never end. But end this evening's bedtime story must, leaving you to your well-earned medieval repose. Sweet dreams, fair listener, and fare thee well till next we.